dramatically in that regard, you know, and I think we need to start thinking about not just small business, obviously, but the people who work for them, okay? And so our biggest concern is that we are going to be separating people from employment. So think about it this way. Somebody owns a dry cleaning operation. They have 5 employees who know how to operate those machines. This person, they're going to see a dramatic reduction in clients and customers coming in, and so now they're forced to lay off the 5 people. So now those 5 people are forced to go home, and not only are they locked up at home, and even if they're collecting unemployment or what have you, they now have a second fear, and that is there a job for me when I come back? And the small business has also some concerns about, okay, so when this ends and I restart, are those employees still going to be there? And if they're not, by the time I find new people and train them, it'll take me another month to be operating or longer, and I can't survive it. So we are trying to figure out what is the most effective way to get cash into the hands of small businesses so that they can maintain payroll for at least a 6-week period and not have to disconnect from these employees. And there is an existing program. There's an existing program, the 7A program. It wouldn't necessarily be that program per se, but we would ideally, at least in my mind, we would use these over 800 lenders across the country, including all the big banks plus, you know, hundreds of small community banks and credit unions and so forth to deliver what would be initially considered a loan, but that up to the full amount of the payroll. And if in fact it is used for payroll, that loan would then be forgiven, and whatever portion of it above that they used for some other purpose can either be returned or would then convert a year from now into a loan. But the bulk of it, of course, would be, if not all of it, would be used for payroll for 6 weeks.
That's huge, what you just said, because I've been trying to figure out how a small business operator would do that. You want to take out a loan, perhaps. You want to pay your employees, but you're never going to get back the sales that you lost over that period of time. If you're a dry cleaner, if you're a restaurant, if you provide any sort of service, those sales are just gone. So your idea is to make sure that that gets to them and is then eventually forgiven for anything they were using to keep their payroll, to keep their employees on the payroll.
Right. So the way to think about it is if your payroll for 6 weeks is $10,000 or $15,000, and you borrow $15,000, and obviously at the end of all this, we'll be able to see from your filings whether you maintained your payroll with the same number and the same figures and so forth. That entire $15,000 would then convert into a grant, basically. Now, if you use $10,000 of it for payroll, and the other 5 you used for some other, whatever it may be that you want to do that's outside of overhead, then a year from now, because there wouldn't be any payments no matter what for a year from now, that would become a traditional small business loan. And of course, the government, Treasury, would guarantee this 100%. But what I like about the proposal, too, is that it isn't a government interaction. We would be relying on our existing network of preferred lenders under this SBA program, and there's over 800 of them across the country. I mean, I'm not branches, 800 individual lenders, including all the big banks, but also scores of community banks and credit unions.
Well, it is a big government program to the extent that it would be federal dollars that would then turn into the grants, correct? These banks would not be on the hook to go ahead and forgive the loans.
Yeah, the alternative is to send everybody, money through the unemployment system, but now you're disconnecting them from employment. Right. And I think the last thing we need here is to be disconnecting people from the security of knowing they have a job to go back to, even when this ends. So people are already facing extraordinary uncertainty, and they're already going to be, inconvenienced and in many ways traumatized in some cases by weeks of not being able to do certain things. And then on top of that, we don't want to add the worry that, well, there's no job. By the way, there's no guarantee you have a job to go back to. And just think of the startup costs and impediments for a business who, okay, we tell them they can reopen, but now they got to scramble to either find the people that used to work for them or hire new people and train them. And in some cases, that alone would be impossible for them to do after going 6 weeks without sales.
I love your plan, but I think it needs to go hand in hand with a program that does extend and boost unemployment benefits for the people whose employers don't take up on those loans or can't qualify for them or don't get access to them. I spoke with a number of people yesterday just talking about one accountant who I spoke with said he has 20 clients, maybe more, who have had to lay off 50% or all of their staff since Monday. And these are talking about moving companies, about caterers, about lawn service and tree companies, tree service companies that go out there. Those employers are already going without paychecks at this point, and there's no guarantee that the small business will immediately hire them all back. There's a restaurateur who we're hoping to get on the show tomorrow in Ohio who on Monday laid off 4,000 employees. He says he needs money from the government to get back up and running, and even if he does, it will still take him 4 weeks before his restaurants are open again. A lot of those employees won't be brought back until the last 2 weeks before that time.
Yeah, so obviously there are people that have already made a decision because the uncertainty, this program is a proposal. It's not in place, which is the urgency behind it. People are making decisions right this very morning about what they're going to do with their staff. And some maybe had 2 or 3 weeks that they can burn through some cash and keep them on hand, but ultimately won't be able to do it. So there are people that are going to be, this is not going to solve every problem. There are people out there that are going to be left without employment, and then obviously there is proposals being worked on to address them. The one I've been focused on is how can we keep as many small businesses viable and connected to their employees for as long as possible so we don't create an additional disruption. And I think it bears saying in all of this, we are not talking here about some systemic failure of the system. We're not talking here about companies that did something wrong and now are asking the taxpayer to bail them out. What we're basically talking about is government edicts, basically a government requirement prohibiting private industry from operating. And so because of a public health emergency, and there is no other alternative. I am not in favor of these programs as a permanent feature of our public policy, but there is no alternative at this moment to inject cash into our economy than the government, because you have prohibited the private sector from operating in various important sectors.
That feeling, that sentiment you just mentioned, just feeling the sense of urgency, do you get the sense that that is universal among the other 99 senators that you serve with in Congress?
No, I think it's widespread. I wouldn't call it universal. I still think there are people that sort of have not come to the realization that we are not dealing with an extraordinary circumstance. I think there are still people that don't realize that we are uncharted territory, that there is no playbook for this sort of thing that we're confronting. I mean, the closest thing to it would be mobilizing a country after World War II as an example. I know that analogy has already been used by others, but there is no playbook for this. But this is an extraordinary, world-altering moment that we're living through. I think there are two things that are certain. Number one is we are going to continue to experience even unforeseen and unexpected impacts of all of this in the days and weeks to come. And number two is that we will not emerge as a country or a world the same after this. There will be changes that will happen systemically. I don't know what all of them will be, but this sort of event that impacts every inhabited continent, every advanced economy in this way is the kind of thing that become pivot points in history for better and for worse.
Senator Rubio, I want to thank you for your time today, and I do hope that your colleagues pick up your sense of urgency very quickly on this. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
The futures are trading as low as they're allowed to in the morning. We are watching the ETFs that closely track the major indexes. And once again, the Dow is down, indicated down more than 6%, just barely, 6.01%. Oil prices slumping again this morning on demand fears, combined with supply fears, right? 24.47 now, down almost 10% on West Texas. And check out quickly how the big banks are looking this morning and how they're trading. Pre-market, you can see Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Citigroup, Wells, Bank of America, all down. Most of them more 5 or 6%, Andrew.
Right. Thanks, Joe. Meanwhile, worldwide coronavirus infections have now topped 200,000. Almost 6,500 cases have been confirmed in the United States, nearly 2,000 more than at this time just yesterday. 114 people here have died. His latest op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, CNBC contributor Dr. Scott Gottlieb talks about the capacity of the U.S. hospitals and how there still could be time to flatten the curve of the rising number of cases. Dr. Gottlieb joins us now on the phone. He's also the former FDA commissioner, of course, and serves on the boards of Pfizer and Illumina, and we are always grateful to have his expertise with us. Good morning to you, Doctor. Let's talk about flattening the curve for a second, because there have been lots of steps that have now been taken over the past several days across this country and in this state and city where we are right now in New York. And as people are trying to look at the timeline of what this may or may not be, the president, of course, mentioned July and August recently. Investors are trying to figure out what this timeline looks like. Of course, the timeline gets extended out, the better we do in terms of flattening the curve to some degree. What are you seeing in terms of estimates and how that flattening is changing, or isn't?
Well, thanks for having me this morning. We're certainly having an impact on the scope of this epidemic and the contours of this epidemic, and how many cases we're going to get at the peak and how long it's going to last. The steps we've taken in the last 2 weeks are very aggressive. I think I'm heartened by what the mayors and the governors have been willing to do. These are strong actions. I think the president's reference was probably to the analysis that's circulating in Washington and the White House. It shows this peaking out late April, early May. Remember, if you peak in April, in the end of April, 7 weeks from now, you still continue to accrue cases for another 7 weeks. That's just the peak. It comes down. So that analysis would show this epidemic continuing the course into late June, and that gets you into July. So I think that might have been what he was referring to. I'm not sure.
Doctor, can you just, on that peak issue, though, so let's say we're in a late April, early May situation. It gets extended out through the end of June, and maybe that's the way businesses should think about this, investors should think about it. If that's the case, though, the social distancing steps and everything else that we're taking today, in your mind, they need to last through the end of June? I mean, I'm trying to understand if people look at the peak, and because people look at what took place in China and elsewhere, and after it started to peak out, as you know, at least in China, some people started to go back to work, and you started to see an increase of business again. Is that the right way to think about it, or not so much?
I think it's going to be very hard to take our foot off the brake if we're still accruing cases. And that's why I think a lot of school closures are going to be in perpetuity. Probably the school year is lost for a lot of these districts where there is community transmission, because you don't want to lift the restrictions too quickly and then have another resurgence in cases. But you can lift them and then put in place other measures. And so, for example, one of the things we might contemplate is, do we require people to wear not N95 masks, which are in short supply, but procedure masks? If we know there's asymptomatic spread or mildly symptomatic young people spreading this virus, the procedure masks aren't in short supply. It's the N95 masks that the healthcare workers need. So there might be other things we can substitute in that could provide some protection as transmission slows down and the risk isn't as great.
What do you know about the supply chain in terms of masks? In terms, Becky had asked about ventilators to several of our guests this morning. Administrator Verma, I think she might have even, at one point, I think when we had asked about, where they were, how many we had, there's not actually a real number out there right now that people want to distribute, or I mean, when I say distribute, disclose rather.
Yeah, we have ventilators in the national stockpile. One official over the weekend used the figure of 12,700. I think it might be slightly more than that, but not much more than that. That's in the stockpile, and I'm sure there's some on order now as well. But there aren't a lot. There aren't hundreds of thousands of ventilators in the stockpile. There could be low tens of thousands of ventilators in the stockpile, or that something around that 12,700 figure. And then nationally, you have about 62,000 full-featured ventilators, and then another 100,000 partial featured ventilators, but those are also assisted breathing devices like devices or BiPAP, and you wouldn't want to use those in this setting because they can actually spread virus. So you really have to focus on those 62,000 full-featured ventilators. And that's a figure from 2010. It's a little bit old. The figure that I used in the Wall Street Journal today is 100,000 ventilators either available or in the stockpile, and I think that's a pretty safe estimate.
Hey, Dr. Gottlieb, I want to bring Becky into the conversation. Bex?
Thanks, Andrew. Dr. Gottlieb, just something you just said about the CPAPs and not wanting to use them right now because they could spread the virus. If you are an older person using a CPAP right now, or somebody with an underlying condition using a CPAP right now, should you stop using it for the duration of this virus?
No, anyone who needs it for a medical reason should use it. I'm talking about in a hospitalized setting, a machine that can provide some pressure, that isn't in an enclosed room where you can actually blow virus around. No, certainly anyone at home who's on any assisted breathing device should continue using it.
Doctor, in terms of, we've been talking to you literally daily, and so trying to understand the progress that's being made one way or the other. If you look at what's taking place in Italy, the numbers continue to ramp. How much should the United States take away from that experience relative to the experience of South Korea? I think one of the other things that investors and, frankly, policymakers are trying to do is look at these different models, and it's very hard to ascertain why certain things are happening in certain regions.
Well, I think what South Korea did was very aggressive testing right at the outset, and an effort to contain and isolate people. They tested 1 in 200 people in South Korea, and they even tested, young people. Right now in the U.S., even though we have more testing capability in terms of platforms, we're still not able to test everyone. Certain people are being told to just stay at home and assume you have coronavirus. The problem with that is that if you don't have a positive test result, you're probably less likely to self-isolate and take it seriously, and you also can't enforce the quarantine without a positive test result in most cases. So testing people and telling them they have it could be very helpful. In Italy, there were a couple things that went wrong. Number one, people showed up at the hospitals when they were sick, and they spread the virus in the hospitalized setting. It's an older population. There's higher smoking rates. So there's reasons why Italy, the background in Italy, was more conducive to a bad outcome relative to what our experience could be if we do the right things.
Okay, Dr. Gottlieb, it's always good to speak with you, and please stay safe out there, and I'm sure we'll be talking to you a lot more later this week. You bet. Joe, over to you.
The futures and trading as low as they're allowed to go this morning. They are locked down limit, but as a result, we watch the ETFs, which are free to trade. You can see the Dow is now indicated down about 6%. S&P down almost, in fact, exactly the same right now. And the NASDAQ, not as much, just over 5%. Take a look at the biggest names in tech. The FANG stocks, trading this morning down anywhere from 3, in the case of Amazon, 3%. To a little bit over 6. Meanwhile, Boeing was in a dominant financial position a little more than a year ago, but now it's seeking billions of dollars in aid from the U.S. government. That's a current quote you've got there, so factor that into the Dow being down limit. Boeing itself down almost 19 points. The coronavirus and the grounding of the 737 MAX both weighing heavily on the aerospace giant. Phil LeBeau joins us now. With more on the top of your head, what was the high, Phil? 4 something, right?
I thought it was like 430, 425, 430, something like that. And look, when Dennis Muhlenberg became CEO, it was something like 137, 138. They've erased all of the Muhlenberg gains that happened back since 2015. And the reason, Joe, you're seeing this stock trending closer to 100 and continuing to be under pressure is this question: how much money will the federal government give to Boeing, and by extension the aviation industry, with loan guarantees, however it's structured? How much aid will be coming their way, and how quickly will it be coming their way? Just for some point of reference, Boeing is seeking at least $60 billion. Now, people are saying, well, is that $60 billion that goes straight to Boeing? Remember, Boeing turns around and about 70 cents of every dollar they're paying out to suppliers. So the aid that would go to Boeing, it's not like it goes into Boeing and they keep it in a vault and they say, well, that's for a rainy day as things get bad. They're immediately turning around and they're paying that money out, at least 70 cents on a dollar. So that's what they're seeking, $60 billion. It would come with some loan guarantees, though the terms have not been laid out at this point. And it would be separate from the $50 to $58 billion that the airline industry is seeking. I know Carter Copeland was on earlier and he said, well, is that $60 billion include money for the airlines? No. That Boeing is seeking $60 billion, at least $60 billion, separate from anything that might go to the airlines. And by the way, we have to talk about a bit. Also, Boeing has drawn down on the $13.8 billion term loan that it took out just a month ago. So that gives you some sense of how quickly the company is burning through cash. It still has other credit lines, but guys, this is a dire situation. And increasingly, you hear people saying, well, look, if the government's not going to step in and step in quickly, what options are out there for Boeing? And I have heard people discussing the possibility of bankruptcy with Boeing. That doesn't mean that Boeing is going to file bankruptcy, but at some point, that discussion has to be had because and you were thinking about bankruptcy, you want to go in from a position of strength with as many assets as possible as opposed to just falling and tumbling into it as we saw with General Motors back in 2009. And one last note, guys, I talked about JetBlue. Just to give you a sense of how quickly the airlines are burning through their cash, they drop an 8K this morning. In the 8K, they tell us that they took out a term loan of $1 billion on Friday, last Friday. How quickly did they burn through it? By Monday. 3 days, and they went through that $1 billion term loan. Robin Hayes out with a note today to employees basically saying that on an average day in March of last year, they took in $22 million from bookings and ancillary fees. Guess what they're taking in right now? Less than $4 million. Gives you a sense of how quickly things have changed for the airlines and how dire the situation is. Guys, back to you.
Okay, Phil LeBeau in Chicago. By the way, quick counter-programming note for a second. It's some news. Apple just announced a new iPad, and I want to thank Tim Cook personally because it has a trackpad, which I've been asking for years. Just some levity to what is a terrible situation right now. Meantime, when we come back, we'll back to the serious issues on the table. Allianz's Chief Economic Advisor, Mohamed El-Erian, on when we might see a light at the end of the tunnel for all this historic market volatility. As we head to a break, take a look at U.S. equity futures. They are pinned at their lower limits right now. You're looking at the market looking to open off about 5 to 6% across the board. Stay tuned. You're watching Squawk Box on CNBC.
Phase 1 agreement.
No one expected it to be so prolonged.
Reducing the geopolitical uncertainty around these two trade deals will have a positive impact on people's perspective.
Phase 1 removes a lot of overhang for the economy.
We were basically escalating to a very bad place between the two countries.
The leaders in China and the US have the wisdom to settle the differences.
Are these trade winds abating, or is there still a threat?
Our customers, they did suffer with the trade wars.
There is now truce and a pathway to peace.
Words like peace, trade, war, things like that, those to me are not the right words. It's not a Berlin Wall at all. We want other people to take down the Berlin Wall.
This is a ceasefire. Hold on to your seats because this isn't going to be solved in one mini trade deal.
The best thing that happened is we have two countries that like each other again because it was getting pretty nasty.
Squawk Alley is live.
Carl Quintanilla, Morgan Brennan, John Fort. Squawk Alley on CNBC.
Welcome back. February housing starts data just hitting the tape, and we are going to go now to Rick Santelli, joins us live from Chicago. Hey, Rick.
Hi, Joe. I'll tell you what, these numbers are a little lower than expected, but there's some really good news here. All right, so on housing starts, 1.599, so just shy of 1.6 million. This is a really good number, actually, and the reason it looks like it's down a bit is because last month had a very, very strong revision. The revision to 1.624 is basically a 13-year high, so when we comp this, just a small drop down to 1.6 or a whisker under, certainly it looks like it's down, what, a little over 1%, but it's still a stellar number. And if we look at permits at 1.464, it's also a little light on expectations, so we're down like 5+% from 1.55 in the rearview mirror. But what's ironic about that is just like on the start side, the permits number 1.55 million seasonally adjusted annualized units is also basically a 13-year high. Both are in the zip code at 13-year highs. So even though they're retracing a bit, based on revisions, they're retracing from really lofty levels. And very quickly, so much going on. The pound, it hasn't traded at these levels on the dollar since we were making Back to the Future movies in 1985. And if you look at the yield curve, 10s minus 2s, zoom, 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 the steepest in about 2 years. And if you look at what's going on in Italy or France, anything outside of the highest sovereign credits in Europe, they're spreading wider, and that's significant. Andrew, back to you.
Hey, thank you for that, Rick. Appreciate it. Meantime, NBA team owners were some of the first people to pledge support for their arena workers as the coronavirus hit U.S. shores. Now, Dallas Mavericks owner Mark Cuban says if companies are bailed out, all employees should have the chance to benefit from a possible turnaround in the form of stock compensation. Mark Cuban joins us now on the phone. Good morning to you, Mark.
Good morning.
We've been through these bailouts before, and there have been a lot of political finger-pointing afterwards. You have a thought about how this should be done?
Yeah, we already know what's going to happen. You know, a year after this, plays out, and it will, we'll look back. We, consider the workers, the everyday hourly worker, the people, making minimum wage. Why didn't we reward them as well? And so let's get ahead of it. And whatever we do in a bailout, make sure that every worker gets compensated and is treated equally, and that the executives don't get rewarded extra to stick around because they got nowhere else to go. The government's taking their risk out of the equation. Let's treat all workers equally.
But how would we do that? Because one of the things that, look, there's going to be all sorts of stimulus plans, bailouts, and the like. And one of the things you want to do is get that money into the system as quickly as possible. You don't want people not to take the money. And so the more strings that you attach to it, and I'm not suggesting you don't, but the more likely it is that certain people may hold back. And so I'm trying to figure out how to capture that balance.
Okay. Two different things. One, getting money into the system is a function of the Fed, and they're obviously taking those steps right now. Two is when there's a bailout. When there's a bailout and the government comes in and offers assistance to an organization, a public company in particular, whether it's an airline, whatever it may be, there are most likely going to be steps taken by the company, and historically this is what has taken place, where they reward the executives. They reprice their options. They give them more stock. They give them more. They give them options, whatever it may be. Whatever it is that a company does for their executives, they should be required to proportionally do the same thing for everyone else that works for the company. Period. End of story. Part one. Part two, no buybacks. Not now, not a year from now, not 20 years from now, not ever, because effectively you're spending taxpayer money to buy back stock, and to me, that's just the wrong way to do that.
Do you think that we're going to have a national bailout for companies across the board? Do you think we should look to airlines or other specific industries for help? I mean, that we should be helping? How would you approach it?
I think we have to. I mean, look, this is cascading, and it's getting worse by the minute. The number of layoffs is just skyrocketing. And so if I walked in the door, first thing I would do is prioritize. And I would create effectively, and this isn't the right word, but effectively create two buckets. Bucket number one, and we have to do these things in parallel. Bucket number one is how do you help companies of all sizes to keep paying their employees and not lay them off or fire them? Because we want to keep people employed. Even if it's make-good work, even if this is the Tennessee Valley Authority all over again, and we're just subsidizing companies to keep their employees on the payroll and finding things for them to do. Because keeping them in the payroll, it will pay off more in terms of minimizing taxpayer requirements than releasing them or fire them or laying them off and them having to go find jobs in the future. So that's bucket number one. Do all you can to keep people employed. Bucket number two, we've already seen significant layoffs. There are people who are already unemployed. That's where we might consider helping people, whereas if you're going on to unemployment or any type of government, federal government assistance, then maybe we pay them a bonus, and that's not a good word for this, but give them a check for the $1,000 to help them get through the immediate need. because they've just been laid off or they don't have a job. And that helps people get through these problem times. But they should be just two very distinct buckets. But the priority has got to be working to help people stay employed. I actually don't like the idea of just giving everybody a $1,000 check, because for a lot of small businesses, if they know that their employees are going to get a check and that business is struggling, they may say, you know what, I'm going to lay them off or fire them because I know they have a backstop of some sort. And when this is hopefully all over in 3 or 4 months, like people are predicting, we'll figure it out then. That creates a far greater stress on the system. So I really think that the priority needs to be, one, keep people employed, and two, those who have lost their jobs. We've seen the entertainment industry, we've seen the hospitality industry, the airline industry, the transportation industry all decimated. And where there have been layoffs, I don't have a problem with those people as they get onto federal assistance, giving them a check up front to help support them and the economy. But we've got to deal with both, and I think the priority needs to be on helping people keep their jobs.
Okay. Mark, hang on for a second. I want to see if we can bring Joe into the conversation. Sure. Joe, you there?
Sure. Hey, Joe.
Hey, Mark. How are you? It's just good. Nobody likes any of this stuff. I mean, all bets are off, aren't they? I mean, these are. I just don't. Anytime we think, we don't want to do this, do we need to talk about moral hazard when you're talking about a deadly virus? I don't know. It seems like any other time I understand, but go ahead.
I agree, Joe. Perfection is the enemy of progress. In normal times, you want to look at all the distribution of outcomes and try to do the best thing that helps the most number of people. But this is a new world, literally. This is the new normal, and we have to just look at what's in front of us and deal with it. And yes. Well, as part of all of this, whether it's a bailout, whether it's a $1,000 check for those who have lost their jobs, we should add, if you try to scam the system in any way, shape, or form, there is jail as your penalty, because we want to introduce a moral hazard. I'm not talking about, something ridiculously draconian, but still, there should be something. It shouldn't be a civil issue. It should be fully a criminal issue, and everybody should know that going in.
Okay. Yeah, and Mark, I just, if we have to decide what kind of snapback we're going to get when we do get through this, and I pray that it's sooner rather than later. How psyched are you going to be to sit on the side? I mean, did you appreciate it enough when you're sitting there watching? I'm jonesing on DraftKings. I'm like, I'm going to bet on like esports, but I don't think you can do that either. But I mean, missing the Final Four, that's going to snap back.
Yeah, here's what I'll say, Joe. We all use sports as a way to celebrate, a way to get excited, the way to come together. Nobody throws a parade when Apple or Google will have the most amazing quarter they've ever had. But when a team wins a championship, they throw a parade. And so hopefully we'll have the Olympics, and we'll be able to come together as a country around our team, the U.S. Olympics team, and that'll be great for us. We'll all get out of the house. We'll all celebrate together. Hopefully when the NBA, the NHL, Major League Soccer, Major League Baseball, football all start to really happen again, we'll all get excited about our teams, and as communities will come together. Sports will be a vital mechanism for bringing people back together when this happens. And so, yeah, I'm excited for that, but in reality, basketball is the last thing on my mind right now. But I will say we're using the Mavericks to try to do as much as we can to keep people energized and engaged while everybody's stuck at home.
Hey, Mark, we're going to try to bring Becky in if we can.
Sure, hey, Becky.
Hey, Mark, Hey, Mark, it's good to talk to you. I saw your reaction. I think we all did. The cameras were on you when you were on the sidelines of the game to find out that the NBA was shutting things down. Your reaction, I think, at that point was something like, "Are you kidding me?" or something along those lines, maybe.
Yeah,
you changed your tune really quickly. What to kind of walk us through your emotional, the hill you kind of climbed and fell back off on the other side?
Yeah, I mean, we had considered all the potential options, the mass management, and really, what really ignited my response was prior to the game, I met with the players, and one of the players said, "What are the chances the season gets suspended or postponed?" And I said 5-10% at most. And, I'd considered it, but I really didn't consider it likely based on the information we had at that time. And then when it came across that Rudy Gobert had been sick and the one game had been canceled and the season had been canceled, I was just stunned. And, then my mind started thinking, the entrepreneur in me took over. Okay, what are the elements that I need to consider going forward? What are my responsibilities? Who's going to be helped? What are the opportunities and who's going to get hurt? And this was so drastic and so outside the realm of anything I really considered likely that's when I started thinking about, okay, who's going to get hurt the most and what can I do and how.
Well, we're just going to take you away from our US colleagues for a moment as we focus on an earnings update. BMW says it expects 2020 pre-tax profit to be significantly lower than the previous year due to coronavirus. The German car maker added the outbreak will hit deliveries in all major markets this year. I just spoke to BMW CEO Oliver Zipse and started by asking him how the virus will hit operations.
The coronavirus is, of course, a very, very tough challenge for society and also for us here at BMW Group. And we take it mostly and most serious. At this time of the year, I think it's very important to close the lines with our employees, but also with our customers, to hold together, to show solidarity. This is our highest priority. And I think in line with that, today we are starting to close our factories all over Europe, mainly due to the forced closure of our dealerships in Europe. So we're taking a break in production, also including the mini plant in Oxford, and until April the 19th. So that's for the next 4 weeks. So that's the very short-term outlook. In the same light, we try to keep business open. We have to service a lot of police cars, emergency cars, police motorcycles and so on. So we try to keep our business running as good as possible. Also because we are preparing for the technical prerequisites to achieve all CO2 regulations in the next coming years. And of course, we are also preparing launching our new cars for the market. So that is happening at the same time. Solidarity with our people, closure of our plants, and keeping our business running. That's the current challenge. Until the end of the year, we cannot fully foresee what the outlook is, but we will see a significant volume drop until the end of the year due to the widespread corona crisis here in Europe, but also in the United States. We see some lights in China, but it's too early to say what the results and effects for the whole year are.
You've talked about closure until April the 19th. Can I ask you why April the 19th? Why 4 weeks rather than 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks? How did you come to that number?
Right. I think it's various factors. First of all, we have looked very closely what has happened in China, how quickly it dropped, and then how dealerships are running up again. So we made some adaptations to that assumption and tried to build up a model what this would happen in Europe and also in the Americas. And that's why we came up with the 4 weeks for now. And also we had some planned shutdowns in our plants, which are right in these 4 weeks. So I think 4 weeks is a moderate guess, what we'll need to accommodate the current decline in customer demand and closing of our dealerships. And we will see further, but I think it's a good guess with the 4 weeks.
Can I ask you then what the likely output reduction will be? You've obviously started to put some numbers on this and how long it will get plant and facilities up and how long it will take to get plant and facilities up and running after the shutdown period. Do you have a good sense now of what the meaningful impact will be on both production and profitability?
Well, I think the most important thing is the synchronized adoption of all the measures we are taking. That means together with our plans, the supply chains have to be synchronized. So that is true for the running down of the plants, but that is also true for the running up of the plants. I think we will see a volume reduction of about 10% worldwide for BMW over the year. That's our current assessment against the result we had last year with more than 2.5 million cars we sold to customers worldwide.
And you mentioned China. Can I just ask you more specifically in terms of supply chains from China to your other plants and operations? Are those now back at 100% or are they 80%? Can you give us a sense of how quickly they're returning?
Yes. What we have seen in China is a quick decline in market demand end of January during the Chinese New Year. We took that closure of our plants and also of our dealerships to extend that period to about 3 weeks. Since some days now, our plants are running again with a slightly reduced volume, but they're running and in operation. The supply chains are intact, and more than 95% of our dealerships are already open again. So you see in China that we are on the way back to normal, and our rough assessment is that by end of April, we should see China on the normal path again. That's our current assumption.
Just setting aside coronavirus, as I look at the numbers as you've reported them here, obviously operating margin in the automotive division fell to 4.9% from 7.2% in 2018. Could you just talk about what challenges that reflects for you as a business, and if we were to try and take these exceptional issues out of the equation, what your margin might look like going forward 2020-2021?
Our prognosis, our forecast for this year, that we will be in the window between 2 and 4% on the EBIT margin. That's our current prognosis for 2020. For 2021, it's far too early to make any announcements.
Well, far too early to make any announcements. I also asked Mr. Zipser about the structural challenges facing the auto industry more broadly.
In January and February, I think we made very good progress regarding our CO2 achievements in 2020. So we are right on track, even a little bit better. And we will see a slight decrease in volume, but the percentage of electrical cars compared to overall volume, I think that is very stable, and we still are committed to achieve our 2020 and 21 targets.
And can I finish, Oliver, just by asking you where you stand on the issue of state support from the federal government? We've seen lots of businesses putting their hand out as they see an immediate impact to revenue and profit from coronavirus. What conversations are you having with the federal and state governments at the moment, and do you imagine there will be some financial support for you?
Well, of course, we were standing in very close contact with regional administration all over the world. We have more than 100 competence teams all over the world who deal with the corona crisis, and we are in contact with public and political administration. Currently, we are still looking how far we can get with our flexibility instruments, mainly banking hours, taking early holiday, and so on. And then we will see whether we need public support, but there's no decision made on that topic yet.
That's interesting. So no decision taken as yet. But can I ask you, obviously those workers who will be on 4-week breaks will be worried that they will be coming back and that there will be jobs for them and that they will get their wages still. Can you confirm at the moment the plan is that all of them will be made good in terms of their wages and their jobs?
Well, currently we can foresee the very immediate future, and that means what is happening in the next 4 weeks. And with our flexibility instruments, with the working banks, with taking holidays, I think at this point in time we should be safe.
Zipser there, the CEO of BMW. That's it for now. We're going to hand you back to our colleagues stateside.
Thank you. We've got, and then you look at Boeing, which is now above 100 and just below 100, sort of trading back and forth this morning. It's at 100 bid, $100.30 assets. I'll get back to Becky. Mohammed, we'll see you, I'm certain, again soon. Thanks for getting in front of the camera for us this morning. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Joe, thank you. Let's get to Jim Cramer, who's standing by as well. Jim, I'm not sure if you heard what Mohammed just had to say about, forget about just a recession, we could be looking at a depression here. What do you think?
Well, I hate to characterize these things because what could happen is it's hard to imagine a depression that could end in a V. Most depressions end in an elongated U, so I'm not sure if it advances the ball. I do love Mohammed. But I tend to like to think about it's a hiatus. It's a stoppage of work. Almost nationwide. Obviously, 2/3 of the country is service, huge chunk of the GDP. So what we have to do is think as big as possible. We have to encourage the government to think as big as possible. You know, a 1.2 trillion and a 19 trillion economy, no, it has to be whatever it takes. You don't try to quantify it because, like Dr. Fauci said the other day, when it came to the when we can possibly expect an end, we expect an end when it ends. And I'm urging Secretary Mnuchin and President Trump to try to think much bigger and try to think about situations that we've had in our history. Not unlike General Marshall in 1939, realizing we're the 17th largest army against forces that are aimed that are much larger. General Eisenhower coming back and realizing that we are in a race against the Soviet Union, or even President Wilson, who had to deal with the flu at the same time as he had to deal with trying to win World War I. Make your priorities. Try to understand how we can have both financial health and actual health, and tell us and lead. And I know they're trying to lead, and I think they're doing an able job. But this is a moment, look, is this an FDR moment where FDR is trying to figure out fear itself? No, because the fear is real. And so it's not the same. But we keep calm. We look for leadership. We look for our brilliant scientists to come up with something. We don't give up hope. That would be a big mistake. We try to figure out opportunity as well as recognizing that the risks are big. But to quantify it in any sort of sense of what it means, let's just keep it historical and keep it factual. Because otherwise what's going to happen is we create panic among the 100 million hardworking people who really are trying to figure out what they're going to put on their dinner table next week. And if they can go shopping for it.
Jim, thank you.
No problem.
I'm going to be watching very closely coming up in just a couple minutes. We'll see you then. Thank you. Andrew?
Thank you. Joining us right now is Stephen Romick. He's Managing Partner and Portfolio Manager at First Pacific Advisors. Good morning to you, Stephen. Thanks for joining us. You heard what Jim just had to say. You also heard what Mohammed has had to say. And also what Mark Cuban has had to say about where this economy is headed, and want to understand where you think, therefore, maybe the markets are headed as well.
Well, I mean, the coronavirus is the first social media virus. I don't want to underestimate its impact, but it certainly has created, at the very least, a pandemic. I mean, stocks are trading down with more fear than I've ever witnessed. And a lot of this volatility is just due to simultaneously dealing with two issues. I mean, the first, financial, the loss or reduction of our individual income or net worth. And as if that doesn't create enough stress, we have the existential risk as we come face to face with our own mortality. We haven't ever collectively faced the two together in the U.S., although that's been the case in other countries. So these two things have created this emotion squared and within an unprecedented negative feedback loop. Lost jobs, lost income, fear of dying or losing a family member or a friend, as most of us twisted up. But if one thinks more calmly about what the longer-term impact might be, it's hard not to want to be somewhat more invested if you were when you were coming into it, assuming you had cash available like we did. Because one day people will again be flying in planes, staying in hotels, eating in restaurants.
Stephen, the question is this a V or is this a U? And if you listen to Stephen Mnuchin, our Treasury Secretary, talk about 20% unemployment in this country, that potentially could be the direction we could go. I would even argue that the market right now is undersupplied.
I think the question is how long does if it is a U and not a V, because I don't have an opinion as to either, how long does the bottom of the U last? Because when we invest, we try to think about where we want to own and be effective. If we can just kind of close our portfolios down and shut the markets down, that's not what I'm recommending. I'm just giving an hypothetical. We just think about shutting things down, at least in our heads, and what these companies will look like in 5 years, or 4 years, or 3 years. That's where I get a greater comfort level while we've begun to lean in a little bit.
What do you think is going to happen to the Treasury market? There's sort of two schools of thought. One is there's going to be a demand problem across the world for Treasuries, given the bonds that are going to be put to market by just about every country. The other view is that maybe we have the cleanest shirt in a what's the phrase in the dirty laundry. So you have to choose how this is going to work out. It's all relative.
Look, I don't know the answer over the short term. I don't know any answer over the short term that you might pose to me. But with the way the governments are printing and borrowing money, it's hard to imagine that rates will remain this low, well into the future, and that we won't have inflation at some point. And I think that one of the worst trades out there is really to be, long treasuries, particularly long-dated treasuries. It's return-free risk.
Okay. Stephen, we want to thank you for joining us this morning on what has been several weeks now of difficult and challenging days. Becky and Joe, back at Casa Kernan and Casa Quick. We will see you tomorrow, maybe from the NASDAQ, maybe from Casa
Do it again.
We'll see.
Do it again tomorrow. Get your Wi-Fi under control, will you?
I will. And thanks to all of our viewers, by the way, who send us, great notes. It's a heck of a moment. Meantime, CNBC's special coverage continues right now.
This is CNBC Breaking News. Market sell-off.
Good Wednesday morning. I'm Carl Quintanilla with Jim Cramer, David Faber, all coming to you live from separate locations as we take precautions with social distancing due to the spread of the coronavirus. Futures limit down. Markets watching COVID-19 cases in all 50 states now. The fiscal, the monetary response, the progress of test kits, travel restrictions, therapeutics, the whole thing. Europe's down 5, oil below 25, and that will take you back to 2002. So, yesterday's gains are obviously in jeopardy. Since February 24, the first big day of the virus sell-off, the average daily move of the S&P, guys, up or down, 4.9%. Jim, don't need to tell you that is unprecedented.
No, the market is trying to figure out how to deal with these uncertain times when you've got both financial health on the line and of course, what we were just talking about with separation, actual health. And I think it's not processing it very well, in part because the liquidity is not there, but also because we're in a highly emotional moment. I mean, yesterday, it looked like the market was up, but the indices lie. I mean, what was really up were things like Hormel. I mean, it's really interesting, but when we put fallout shelters in the country in 1961, one of your first things to do was, yes, put in Spam. And the other day it was Chef Boyardee with Conagra. The wrong stocks are going up is what I'm saying, Carl. It's the companies that we invoked during thermonuclear war times, and I'd like to try to see that we'd be more constructive than that. But that was what was up in the index, that and the drug stocks, kind of a rally, half-hearted rally in the semis. So it's easy to see what we'll give back. But don't forget, yesterday may have been a bottom for some of the more Johnson & Johnson-like stocks, the AAAs. They can trade lower, but obviously that's something you want to buy if you think there's a snapback. But otherwise, we have to do some triage, not unlike what I think they have to do in the healthcare system. And you always hate to even use that word because what it reminds us is that some have to live and some have to die. But you know what? I want to be constructive because that's what's necessary for the country. Yep. But I also want to be realistic. Can't cost people a lot of money who are watching. And for instance, I think that number one on the agenda right now is something something big, much bigger than 1.2 trillion. We need something. We need a new entity, Carl. As if this were not the New Deal, we need at least an NRA that makes it so that we don't wipe out the little guy. At the same time, we need a gigantic credit entity, not the ones we have right now. We need Congress to go over with the Treasury Secretary, the Federal Reserve, and perhaps do maybe it's $1 trillion Treasury offering. Maybe that's what's needed.
Yeah, that's why we're going to rely on you, Jim, not just for your market knowledge, but your experience as a small businessman who has employees and has to make decisions that 30 million other small business owners are having to do as well.
Yesterday, Carl, and it's brutal. My wife we're going to pay people 50% of their salary for the 25-some employees over the course of the next 2 weeks. And then, look, I'm a person of means. I'm not going to let these people have I'm very lucky and very blessed, and so we will do something more than that. But at the same time, I recognize these conversations are happening all over the country, and the one we don't want to have is at Boeing. And I know I listened to Phil this morning, and yes, they need 60, but it's not 60 billion for them. It's 60 billion for the supply chain. There's 17,000 little guys, so to speak, and it's a national defense issue as well as it's transit. So if you have to prioritize, I'm going with Boeing this morning as a way for the federal government, for Steve Mnuchin, and for President Trump to actually say, okay, look, we've got an entity, and the first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about the really maybe a total of 2 million people who are involved with aerospace, and we'll use that as a template. And David, I think you know, it's one of those moments where it's the credit side, not the equity side. And we talk equities because a lot of our investors have them, but we always forget, and you remind us that it's the credit side that we're most worried about.
Yeah, and you know what's interesting, of course, guys, is that companies that can raise money are being advised to do so. And so yesterday in the investment grade market, you saw Verizon raise $3.5 billion. You saw ExxonMobil raise $8.5 billion. You saw Pepsi raise $6.5 billion. Exxon did it at, I think, 10 years at 240 basis points over the corresponding treasury. At 30 years, 265 basis points over. Boeing can't do that. Boeing cannot raise money right now in the investment grade market. To your point, Jim, Boeing needs the U.S. government to come to its support or indicate some sort of support before it will be in a position to go out and raise the money that it needs. And that kind of points to where things are right now. But it is interesting to note that those companies, at least, Exxon, Verizon, Pepsi, were able to raise significant amounts of money. And again, many companies can't. High yield is closed right now. The average yield is 10%. You could imagine it's trading at 940 basis points over, and there's no issuance going on there right now. So credit is certainly got to be a focus, Jim and Carl, and will be from here in terms of companies' ability to raise additional funds for what they know is going to be potentially weeks and months of tumult.
Yeah, I mean, you know, Carl, I think that we need to think bigger. We put a price tag, 1.2 trillion. Here's the price tag. It's whatever it takes. It's whatever it takes to keep the men and women, the 100 million people who are who are losing their jobs, or I mean, let's say the 2018. What do we have in the number of people? 309 billion in payroll and restaurant and bar, 87 billion in hotel, 63 billion in performing arts. Thank you, New York Times. 59 billion in transport, 56 billion in amusement. Well, you know what? You can advance all the loans you want to buy small business and all these others. We don't want loans. We want you to pay these people while we wait for the virus to be defeated. And there, I think it's just a question of a Manhattan Project. Every single one of the scientists that I've spoken to at these big drug companies and little ones are all working on something of great consequence. We just need to wait until they find it. We can't afford to shut down the whole country without the country having something that even FDR would be hard to grasp.
Right. The question, Jim, was going to be what conditions... This is going to be part of the new thing we work out, guys, in all the different places. Jim, what conditions are there going to be on industries that are bailed out? We got suggestions from Cuban, no more buybacks ever. Elizabeth Warren has a more expansive look at how it's going to change the way companies manage their balance sheets forever.
Well, why don't we get through it first? Look, these are two people whose principles I admire. I had Senator Warren on just, what was that, a week ago? But it seems like about a couple of years. A lot of equity issues need to be brought up. I already tweeted that I completely agree with Mark Cuban. My problem is that, and all these people are brilliant. We need to get, obviously, a team, a working cluster of people. It can't just be the Treasury Secretary. It can't just be Vice President Pence. It can't be the President. We need an entity, and an entity that let's say, gets permission from Congress for $1 trillion 30-year which we could use, by the way. We used to worry about the Chinese selling their third. We need 30-year. And then have some entity decide who lives and who dies. Obviously, we just have to say who lives. And then we can have all these equity issues. A CEO who borrowed too much money. Well, we have to figure out whether that CEO should remain. But what I really want to do is, rather than punish, want to be constructive. There are entities that we can deal with later, but we have to get the money to aerospace. We have to get the money to the 100 million people who work in the service economy. We have to get the money to the working person. And then let the rich people worry about themselves. It's funny because I found myself reading Lenin last night. Now, that's something you typically don't want to go into on a business show, particularly in the first 8 minutes. But, we need to have the means of production to continue. And we need the government, without, of course, rounding up the kulaks, we need the government to be thinking bigger than it ever has since 1932. And I hope they do that. And not like, look, the president is uniquely focused on what's big. This is the moment. No one is going to come back to him and say, you know what? You took too much and gave too much to the working person. No one in history in the next 50 years is ever going to say, you know what? President Trump thought too big. This is the time to think big.
Right. Jim, in listening to you, what you're offering is a similar conversation that I've had with a number of people in our financial system with great responsibility. How you get the money, though, to the companies so that they can guarantee the employment of the people that they otherwise would be and are beginning to furlough or beginning to lay off right now remains somewhat unclear. What's the mechanism by which you can do that? I think is something that's got to be thought through, but there's not a lot of time.
Well, what we're going to hear from, I believe, for Secretary Mnuchin during this hour, communicating with him. I mean, it's kind of the live TV that we have to do. But you're absolutely right, David. I think that one of the things that, again, Congress, Treasury Secretary, President, everyone has to get together with the Fed and say, listen, let's get the money, and then we'll deal with how to administer it. But I'd love to see a team, just like we have a working team with Dr. Fauci and Vice President Pence, let's just get a working team right now that decides, okay, listen, we're going to ring fence and keep certain industries, and then we'll deal with it later. No one's going to make any money. We just want to make it so that working people continue with their jobs. And David and Carl, you know what is front and center? It's the actual service industry, the restaurant industry. It's taken a huge hit from the coronavirus. It's probably one of the most exposed, obviously, because we're telling people, listen, we don't want you to be in business, but we want you to keep paying your people. So we need to we need to speak to one of the people whom I regard as being a young deacon in the industry. We need to speak to David Gibbs. He's the CEO of Yum Brands, which employs tens of thousands of people and is trying to keep them on the payroll. So, David, thank you for joining Squawk on the Street. First, could you give us the scope of the situation for your company, then for the industry, and what you need and what you can do?
Sure. Thanks for having me, guys. Look, my number one message is we are open for business. Our restaurants have means to access us in a safe food in a low-contact environment. That's through drive-through, delivery, carry-out. That's 18,000 restaurants in the U.S., 50,000 around the world. We have more restaurants than anybody else. We know a two-word thing about those channels and how we can provide that food to customers in a safe manner. So open for business. And, of course, what guides us during times like these is what's always guided us, and that's our customers, our employees, and our franchisees. Jim, you said, tens of thousands of employees. Actually, in the United States, we have over 400,000 employees. That's got to be our number one priority right now, making sure these restaurants are operational, serving customers safe food in a way that they can, return to a little normalcy with our comfort food and our great value for them during tough times.
David, how do we assure health, and how do we assure the health of your patrons? I, for one, was possessed with my restaurants. Are we going to serve fresh food? Is it going to be clean? Or we have to worry? I mean, what are the positions? And I know you're in contact with Yum China, different company. What did they do there? I mean, even from Federal Express today, they're back to normal with China. I want to know what they did to transition between the abyss and now, where it looks like they're almost back to work. Give us the Yum China blueprint.
Look, all of our business in Asia obviously has dealt with this issue, so we're learning from them, as you mentioned. Yum China has been a leader, and their great CEO, Joey Watt, has done a fantastic job of reacting to the situation. And, you've seen some of the things that they've done in terms of safety and hygiene, rolling out, this idea of contactless delivery. They invented that concept. You're now seeing a lot of the companies in the U.S. start to play with it. We've already rolled that out in our U.S. restaurants. But look, in times like these, you need to be quick, agile, and you need to learn. You need to double down on what we have at Yum, which is already very strict food safety and hygiene procedures and cleaning and sanitation. You know, we view our food safety as above and beyond. We're the largest restaurant company in the world. We've built trust with our consumers. We need to lean in on that and lead. So we do a lot of things electively before this situation developed to ensure the safety of the food supply that we provide customers. If you show up at one of our restaurants to work, the first thing you do is go through food safety training. If you're washing your hands, you wash your hands, then you sanitize them, and then you put on gloves. That extra step of sanitizing is not in every restaurant. We've been doing that for years. And then we do extra food safety audits beyond what the health department requires, just because it's the right thing to do for our customers and our employees. And we recertify those employees every year. But in times like this, you've got to go further. So what you see now is you see our employees wearing gloves at the drive-through and the front counter, and leaning in on this idea of contactless delivery, where you can place an order online and really avoid any contact with somebody else and get that food delivered to your door or pick it up in the restaurant in a contactless way.
Hey, David, Credit Suisse today says they see a quarter of households shifting 50% of their meal spend to home for the next 4 months. So this massive shift of share from restaurants to grocery, to the degree you're trying to protect it, can delivery and drive-throughs and contactless delivery, how much throughput can it offer?
Look, this is going to have different impacts on different restaurant companies. We're obviously well-positioned in terms of the impact it's going to have, because our brands tend to have more off-premise consumption. So Taco Bell, for example, in a drive-through, 75% of their business was already in the drive-through, plus some carry-out business. We weren't as reliant on the dining room. Obviously, Pizza Hut with delivery and carry-out, and then KFC. You know, there's nothing better than taking a bucket of chicken home for your family during times like this. So I think we're well positioned to deal with that, but it's certainly going to be a headwind for the entire industry and for us, and that's why we're going the extra mile right now to make sure we're set up to serve America. I mean, I think the thing that people forget is, they think of us as large companies, but these are small businesses all around the country. Those 18,000 restaurants I mentioned, they're all run by franchisees. They're small business people. They're one of my highest priorities right now, to make sure that we protect them and they can come out of this on the other end whole. And, our brands have been around for 60 years, a big part of the fabric of the country. The best thing we can do right now is those operators of 10 or 15 units in your community, go visit those restaurants, help them help their business, and have some great food at the same time.
And are you forgiving rent franchisees that do pay you for rent?
Well, the model you're talking about is one that some of our competitors use, where they own the real estate and then the rent is paid to the parent company. We don't have that model. Our franchisees are, as I say, they're small businesses. They have their own landlord situation. Sometimes they own the real estate, and they're dealing with that on a case-by-case basis. What we will do is provide them some guidance in how they think through that with their lenders, with their landlords, and with other obligations that they have.
David, what are you and your franchisees seeing right now in terms of your supply chain? Where are you focused? Are you seeing any hiccups or significant dislocations in that supply chain? Are you concerned about what may be coming, and what are you doing to potentially deal with that?
Yeah, actually, we're lucky. As the largest restaurant company in the United States, we have a massive supply chain co-op that services all three of our brands, over $5 billion in food purchasing a year. So we have a lot of professionals working on that challenge. Now, what I will say is, obviously, some of the demand has dried up in the restaurant industry, so we don't really see supply as a big challenge now, because we have the great professionals working against it, and because there are restaurants closing. There is going to be some excess supply out there, but it's also just another reason that customers need to be frequenting our restaurants. It's not just the 400,000 employees in the restaurants; it's all the people that work on the supply chain. It's the farmers, the people in the factory. It's keeping all of them employed by giving your business to the local businesses in your community.
David, I appreciate everything you're saying. We have a $309 billion employee compensation for 2018 in payroll. This isn't big enough. You're not speaking big enough. You're talking about people going to restaurants. How much money do you need from the federal government to pay your people without a loan, to pay everyone involved in your chain. Because let's be realistic, no one's going to be able to get through to the other side. You're facing a Jordan River here. And I think it's really great that we might want to go get a bucket of KFC. Love it myself. But I need to know, if you were Secretary Mnuchin right now and you created a $1 trillion fund, how much would David Gibbs and his team need, and how much would the restaurant group need? Because you're not going to be able to make it up with patrons.
Yeah, look, as you say, Jim, I'm focused on our part of the industry, and I recognize that these problems are bigger and broader than just the restaurant industry. But as far as what we need, I was fortunate enough to participate in the call that the White House had yesterday with Secretary Mnuchin and President Trump, and I was really pleased with the message I heard, which is they understand that keeping restaurants open for business is important for our economy and important for a safe food supply for everybody that lives in this great country. So there will be challenges, certainly financially, if sales soften. And the people that need the money is not Yum Brands. The people that are going to need the money are our great franchisees that are spread throughout this country. So this is more of a small business problem than it is a big corporate problem, and I think the administration understands that.
David, as we're talking, Starbucks authorization, $40 million repurchase. What is the buyback playbook from here?
Sure.
Well, obviously, the prudent thing for us to be doing right now is to making sure we have as much available for our franchisees and helping them in any ways that we can. Yes. So, we'll talk more about this when we get to our earnings call, but we're taking all the necessary actions that you could imagine, so that's not necessarily in our playbook.
David?
And David, finally, at least for me, how long do you anticipate that we're going to be dealing with this situation?
Look, I think that's an open-ended question. If I had the answer, I'd tell everybody. We've seen it play out in other markets, and we've seen some of them get to the other side. And I think it just depends on how cautious we are and the actions that we take as a country right now. And that's why I think we all should be very vigilant and follow all the protocols that and all the guidance that we're getting. And that includes not eating in restaurants, but accessing them through drive-through, delivery, and carry-out channels.
David, in the end, we are a business channel, and we wanted to talk about shareholders. Is it possible to have a situation where we actually bail out the workers, which ultimately is better for the shareholders than bailing out the shareholders themselves and the entity and the executives? And the reason I mention that, we're dealing with issues of equity that Mark Cuban, who is, I think, a great thinker of our time, is really addressing. And I want the workers to be protected, which I think ultimately will make it so that the entities get saved. Can you save the workers? Can you worry about health care and also save the entity itself?
Look, I think anything's possible, and it's just about how much money we spend. And I totally get the point that our focus should be on employees, small businesses, the people on the front lines of this, because then the entire chain benefits. But we also obviously need to be careful. We can't let large corporations tip over because that would have obviously the impact on unemployment would be huge. So it's just a balancing act.
Yeah, so that's well said, David, and really want to thank you for coming on, given the fact that you are the largest and probably at the front line of what we need to do for the country right now. That's David Gibbs. He's the CEO of Yum Brands. Carl, back to you.
All right, Jim, thanks for bringing that to us. Let's get the latest coronavirus headlines this morning. For that, we'll turn to Rahel Solomon back at HQ. Hi, Rahel.
Hi, Carl. So just this morning, worldwide cases crossed 200,000 with more than 8,200 dead. In the U.S., cases are soaring as the virus spreads and more people get tested. There are more than 6,400 confirmed cases and 114 people have died. And the virus is now in all 50 states after West Virginia reported its first case Tuesday afternoon. Around the globe, nations are fighting the virus through increasingly tight restrictions on movement while committing trillions of dollars to combat the economic crisis. The European Union will close its borders and close off at least 26 countries to almost all visitors for 30 days. The World Health Organization now declaring Europe the epicenter of the outbreak. And back here at home, state and local officials trying to enforce social distancing are implementing a patchwork set of measures, some going well beyond the administration's recommendation that Americans avoid bars, restaurants, and gatherings of 10 or more people. San Francisco's shelter-in-place requires some 6.7 million Bay Area residents to stay home until at least April 7th. New York City's 8.6 million residents also bracing for the possibility of similar rules and within the next 48 hours. And then just this morning, the largest public transportation system in North America, the MTA, here in the New York City area, announced it is seeking a $4 billion federal bailout. The MTA saying that it has seen ridership plunge more than 50% on its subways and buses compared to the same time last year. Carl, I'll send it back to you.
All right. Thank you very much, Rahel. Jim, let's get some mad dash action today.
Yeah, obviously, when you start thinking about public transit, everything is on the line. There's a stock that was at $439 last year.
Double digit.
This week, $439, and that was Boeing. And now Boeing looks like it's going to be at 100. I think Boeing is front and center. Why? Because Boeing will run out of money. They managed to be able to very smartly bring down the revolver. They have, I think, about $10 billion. But there are 2 million jobs on the line. That when we figure out who to triage, we must save Boeing, so to speak, both from the side that the airlines are going to get money, but if you don't have maybe one of the, if not the most important company in the country, solvent, then I think a lot of things are going to go wrong. If we find out that maybe the government takes a stake in Boeing, maybe Boeing gets some sort of lifeline for the workers, then I think today goes better. If we just decide that Boeing is thrown to the wolves of the market, then Carl, you and I and David, we're going to have a very different day, along with 317 million other Americans. So my mad dash is that Boeing and its 17,000 suppliers need the $60 billion. It's not a plea for me. It's a plea for the 2 million workers who are in the supply chain.
Yeah. Jim, it's David. I mean, you know the answer to that. And listening to you ask the question, there's no way the U.S. government can let that happen. No. Now we can all go back a few months and talk about the problems that Boeing created for itself, a story that we were following every day with the 737 MAX. But it doesn't matter now. Those numbers that you're citing in terms of its impact on the economy, it simply seems impossible to imagine the U.S. government can let this company go, dare I say, bankrupt. And if they don't come to its aid, it won't be able to hit the capital markets. But if they do, it certainly might.
But a line of credit, David, that's advanced by a company created by the U.S. government. And I say company only because I think this is a business, basically, the business of the $1 trillion or $2 trillion, whatever it takes. I'm invoking now Lenin and Malcolm X. This is some morning. But I do feel that it absolutely has to be addressed. Now, David, I would say, what is the priority? It can probably wait till 11:30, 12:30. Maybe that's about it.
Today? Timeline, yeah. I don't know. I'll leave that to you.
Okay, you want to make it 4 o'clock?
This does seem to be it seems to be let's call it a hour-by-hour story.
Well, how long does $9 billion last in a business where you got to pay suppliers, right? I mean, I think the answer is as long as they have money. But, look, the president, I hope he's watching, whatever, who the hell's watching. But I do know that Boeing is the one that you settle first, not JCPenney.
Jim, so yesterday when we were getting reports floated of $50, $60 billion for airlines, and you saw airline shares down, how much of that is related to the fear that if bailouts happen, Common gets sacrificed?
Well, I mean, I think that let's deal with this is a great question, Carl. I mean, I think that the way you can get Congress to budge and put trillion, 2 trillion, again, whatever it takes, is to have it go for the employees. I myself feel that if you pay the employees, you're not necessarily going to do well if you own the common stocks, definitely. But that's something, again, we have to settle out. What I was hoping for is a situation where if you have an entity that we once saved, we know that if the government were to take a stake, 10%, you got to be really creative here, 10% American Air, 10% United, 10% Delta, 10% Southwest, 10% JetBlue, 25% Boeing, whoever else needs it. These companies, when we solve this, and I think we seem to forget that we are going to solve this, and who's going to solve it is American science, it's going to be the greatest investment the government ever made. The companies are all going to stay in business, and then we don't have to think about the who lives, who dies scenario. As long as we ring-fence the industries that we absolutely need. Again, I come back to, we all get personal about these things. Do we want to save a company whose clothes end up in a landfill that's made of polyester and it's imported from China? You know what? That's not high on my list. But I do think that what happens here is we need to make decisions, whether I prefer investments, if not investments, then payments to the employees, and then let the shareholders kind of scramble. I don't like that because we're a shareholder-friendly network, but it's the credit side. And I go back to David. David, we look at the equity side and we think, where is it in the pecking order? We know from, unfortunately, bankruptcy law, it's not that high, and we don't want all these companies to go bankrupt. But David, it's the credit side that theoretically has to be protected first.
Yes, and it's the credit side that will dictate terms conceivably in these kinds of situations or fairly soon. And when you're talking about bailouts of the likes that we may be dealing with, Jim, as you well know, you may be penalizing and or pushing down hard on that equity. There's still $70 billion of equity value at Boeing, for example. So how exactly any bailout of that company would work is unclear. But you would not necessarily want to be in a position of rewarding the equity holders, I wouldn't think. Creditors are the key here, and of course, as you point out, they take the primary role when we get to that point, if we get to that point with any company. And there are going to be a number of them where that, of course, is going to be the key. But right now, to the points you've been making all morning long, the focus is how do you get money to these businesses that will guarantee they keep employment where it is? Because once we get through this, we know that it will be money good, most likely.
Right. That's what's so important. It will be money good, particularly if we do it in a creative way. I mean, I think that we're all kind of stuck with a TAF, or these different letters that came from the previous go-around. Those were about saving the banks. I want to go back to AAA and CCC and NRA, and we do our part. We do have to go back to FDR. If we sit here and we just think, well, Jay Powell get in a room with Treasury Secretary Mnuchin, you know, we're like Hoover. We can't be Hoover. We got to be FDR.
We hopefully remember those lessons, Jim, but you're talking about industry-wide triage. Right. Is your argument that we need to save aerospace and airlines more than, say, retail or travel and tourism or restaurants or energy?
Some things I'm going to leave to people who are elected officials to make that determination. I mean, you know, I have my own view. I'm a person who's on TV. I would like to think that there are some national security companies that must be saved. And then the next part of the pecking order is a base of the country that we know is needed. And then under that, I just want to protect the employees. For instance, when I was listening to Mr. Gibson, Yum, do I want the shareholders of Yum to be made whole? Absolutely. But more importantly, I want the people who work for Yum to be able to put dinner on the table next week. And I know, again, it sounds like what I'm saying is I'm abdicating capitalism. It's the opposite. As David said, we're going to win. And when it comes back, we're going to have a healthy workforce, and we'll make these companies come back. But here we go with the market. And obviously the market is saying, let's do something big.
Right on cue, Jim. There is the opening bell and the S&P 500 at the CNBC Real-Time Exchange. At the big board, once again, Chris Taylor, Vice President of NYSE Listings. At the NASDAQ, it is the New York Foundation for the Arts. So, circuit breakers, first one down 7%. You're all familiar by now, would be 52.15. Right. All right, so not quite there, Jim.
No, you're talking about December 24th. Of 2018, when we believed that there was going to be some sort of recession because we had raised rates very quickly, and Chairman Powell was talking about 3 more rate hikes. Remember the October 4th, October 5th double play, where Vice President Pence made a kind of an allusion to a containment policy against China, and then we had Fed Chief Powell talking. I was on Ellen about raising rates. That is where we got to, and I believe we have to slice through that, given about how. I mean, 2391 seems almost idealistic, given what we know. But remember, there are 2 groups of companies. There's the what I call the hunters and the gatherers. And the hunters are the ones with a good balance sheet, and the gatherers are the ones that need people to gather, and they're shut down. So you want to be among the hunters. Go back to yesterday at the low and take a look at where the companies that have the AAA balance sheets, good balance sheets, that don't need to tap any credit line everywhere but are self-funding, and they're going to bottom maybe at some point today. But then there's everybody else. So we're really I'm talking about 15% of the S&P that's interesting to me, and then 85% that better be interesting to the President and the Treasury Secretary.
2346 would be the December 18 low.
That's utopian.
Which, of course, not breached yet. Jim, I wonder what you make of 2 things. First off, Bill Ackman telling the president to essentially shut down the country for 30 days, calling it an extended spring break, stay home with your families. And then Mark Cuban, who talked about not just sports, but his view that we're getting into more of, I don't want to say normal, but at least net rational trading range, at least in the last couple sessions.
Well, I mean, I think that there are a lot of companies. I mean, I look at General Mills reported a quarter, and it's very funny, Carl. Was General Mills
General Mills quarter was a miss, all right? But we're in, can we come up with something better than new normal, for heaven's sake? But General Mills was a miss, and the stock's only down 91 cents after being up $5.80 yesterday. Shows you exactly where we are these days. You can miss and still not repeal the gain. I like what Mark Cuban's thinking. I respect Bill Ackman very much. Now I sound like my friend Larry Kudlow, and when you start with, with all due respect. But the problem with shutting down the country is it's the working people. I mean, my wife advanced her hairdresser $500 this morning. And I said, why 500? She's a colorist. National emergency. I thought myself, there are gallows humor here, but these are the people, they're trying to figure out how to put food on the table. And when they hear hiatus, what they think is end of days. And we want to be more in the Cuban trading range than we want to be in the end of days apocalyptic. Let's get that off the table.
Yeah.
Because
David,
we got to get that off the table. That's scary even to me.
Yeah, I know. David, one of the heartening things this morning was Gottlieb on Squawk saying the actions that we've taken already regarding restrictions are going to change the trajectory of this spread. He said he was heartened. He said that these are aggressive measures.
Yeah, and we've been talking about that now for a bit of time, of course, this idea of flattening the curve, which has become a nationwide mantra. There are positives to be gained from the actions that have taken place. Think about where we were even as little as a week ago, guys, and where we are right now in terms of what's going on. Obviously, it is going to have a debilitating effect, as we all know, on economic activity, which is what we're spending our time talking about. But the good news is, at least, that we can imagine that the spread of the disease, or of the virus, I should say, will be slowing, we can expect and hope. And that will have a positive impact. Carl, we don't know the numbers. We won't know. We're only really now getting to the point where we're able to test people quickly and efficiently. And that is something that we'll have to wait and see. But you're right to point that out, Carl. And I'm glad you did. And obviously, we all listen very closely to Gottlieb and what he has to say.
Boy, Carl, you have it right. There's a Bree Carrere. She's a Executive Vice President, Chief Marketing Officer of FedEx. Last night on a call, I mean, it's hard to find solace in companies when you're talking about something so bigger than companies, but they're talking about how things came back in China, and that they're talking about that there are basically full business as usual. The excellent COO talked about how there were 246 flights in and out of China just last week, aligned with our normal flight schedule. It's a reminder what happens if we keep cool and carry on.
Yeah, exactly, Jim. I mean, there's a big debate about the veracity of China data, and they kicked out the Journal and Times the journalists in 10 days. So what data can we trust? How about Starbucks this morning? Again, a few moments ago, 90% of China's stores are in fact open.
Yeah, I mean, we have to look at the data. I know, for instance, the government once said, the Chinese government wants Disneyland to open up. And I think that Disney, of course, is most conscious of health, wants it to work best as possible. But Kevin Johnson, actually, from Starbucks, made me feel good, too. Now, what's feeling good? It means that if we keep the fabric of the country alive through this period, we're going to get to where FedEx was yesterday when they did their call. And I think we'd be damn foolish to think, okay, let's think small, 1.2 trillion, and then we get to that. Everyone go take a spring break, particularly the 20-year-olds who think that they're invincible and immortal, and then come back and infect the rest of us. But, just like hold on, both between the science and the fact that we're doing what Dr. Fauci wants. I don't want us to find that just when we got to the promised land, it's only Aaron that gets there. It's really important that everybody get there. And the way to do that is to tide people over. That money's going to come right back. I'm really conscious of what David said. It's going to come right back. But we've got to let the scientists like Regeneron that I owned last night, very positive about what they have for antiviral, very positive for a summer vaccine, and what we're doing with containment, because how did FedEx get full strength? How did Starbucks come right back? Because they followed a protocol. We're following the protocol. I hate all the negativity about what we're doing and what we're not in Washington. They're doing their darn best. Whoever thought of this? But we see from Starbucks and FedEx that there is a promised land. Let's get there, and then we can deal with the issues of equity.
Yeah. Guys, something else, of course, that would be a story we'd be focused on very much would be the drop in the price of oil. Obviously, it is related to a large extent to the drop in demand. But as we also know, there's this completely separate story in terms of the Saudis and the Russians of a week and a half or so ago. We got WTI where trading around 25. I don't have a monitor here, so I can't see it on my. But what about that side of things, Jim? You know, in terms of oil and gas, do we have similar expectations?
Okay, so here
that we're going to actually see these.
But we have
these companies.
Yeah, but this is bad. I shouldn't characterize bad. It's complicated. Nuance. Rusty Brazil, whom I use from RBN Energy, without mentioning company names, just points out right. There's parts of the Permian, which is in Texas, that can still eke out some positive returns below 30, especially with drilling services getting so cheap. You saw the Halliburton furloughs yesterday. So the scoop and stack of Oklahoma, dead. Okay, except for a small corner. Eagle Ford, dead. Very small pieces of the Rocky and Bakken can survive below 30. The big companies can cut CapEx, and obviously there's Chapter 11s ahead. But you're right, David. I mean, to not focus on the destruction that the Saudis and Russians are actually inflicting upon us, it's a little ridiculous. I mean, I don't understand why our president doesn't pick up the phone and call the Saudis and say, you know what, this is a two-way street, buddies. You want protection. Stop making it so our industry goes under. It's fine to have oil low, but don't join the Russians in an attempt to be able to destabilize the greatest job engine. What's really, think about what's important here. We like to have energy independence. We don't want the Saudis to take it away from us. How many people do we have? How many men and women in service do we have to make sure the Saudis can keep pumping? And they are trying to put us out of business? I mean, I think that a phone call from the president ends that, not just to fill up the SPR. I'd make that phone call probably, I don't know, about 7 minutes ago.
Jim, briefly here below 20K, 19,999. We'll point out VIX is down 6 points to
That's
75.
Isn't that interesting?
Yep. And Jim, so much conversation this week about sector correlation, stock correlation. You do want to see that start to break apart to inform you that there is some underlying repair.
Totally. We want to see the VIX go down while the stocks go up. Obviously, there's so much in flux here. I think we have to go, again, I want to emphasize super huge. The Treasury Secretary President, let's not use 1.2 trillion. Let's just say, you know what number we were going to use? We're going to use the number that makes it so that 100 million people don't get thrown out of work. That's our number. And when we figure out how much after it costs to do that, and then we're going to reassemble, because think about what happened with China. They got here. Think about what happens if Gilead's drug works, if Regeneron's drug works. Think about what happened if the J&J project works. Those are going to. These are our Manhattan Project people. There are lots of retired people who will have their savings in the stock market destroyed unless we throw trillions at this. Let's think about the retired people. Let's think about the people who are on fixed income where they're getting no income, and recognize that this is no different from 1933, except for please don't confiscate our gold, as the president did that.
Yeah. Guys, listen, one day we're going to be talking deals again, I hope. At the end of this, of course, there's an expectation, I think, that we're going to see a lot of potential consolidation of those who are the winners and the not winners. But I did want to mention at least a couple of pieces of news. And we've had so many dislocations in so many markets. Obviously, in the takeover market, so to speak, spreads have blown out, as you might expect, as money has been withdrawn, as so many hedge funds are dealing with so many different areas that they're pulling out. And the spreads have blown out. One, though, Jim, that we've been very focused on, of course, is AbbVie and Allergan. You've talked about it many times. AbbVie been one of your favorite stocks, I know, of these last few weeks as well. We should point out the FTC did grant preliminary approval based on a consent decree that the companies have entered into, and they are now talking about a close in May for that deal. And the spread has tightened this morning, of course. It was trading at something like a 12% gross, meaning, within by May, you could realize almost that much. And in this market, that is saying something. Whether anybody would actually move into it was another question. We're not going to see any deals right now, but I did want to mention that in particular. The only deals we will see, of course, are ones that are done out of desperation.
Absolutely. Now, look, AbbVie Yield 7, my Chapel Trust owns it. I'm very excited about the new Allergan drugs. I'm the spokesman for the for the American Migraine Foundation. That's what I need right now is a migraine. And I would say that I thought that the pill that they have, which is an acute pill to be able to get rid of migraine in an hour and a half, of which mine only took about 45 minutes, is so good. But the market doesn't care right now. The stock's down 4, the 7% yield. Don't feel that Mr. Gonzalez is doing his thing. I think that's ridiculous. But I know, look, David, there was a time when I would say, you know what, I'm going to drill down on AbbVie. But right now I'm trying to drill down on the 100 million people, trying to figure out what they're having next week. And maybe they can go to KFC and maybe they can't.
Right. That's a good point, Jim. As we're talking, guys, the president's tweet, we will be, by mutual consent, temporarily closing our northern border with Canada to non-essential traffic. Trade will not be affected. Details to follow.
Okay.
Let's get to Eamon Javers in Washington with more on that and perhaps other things, too. Good morning, Eamon.
Yeah, good morning, Carl. As you say, the president tweeting that he'll be shutting the northern border with Canada. He said trade is not going to be affected. This is something that's been under discussion for the past couple of days. They had not wanted necessarily to do that, but clearly the president deciding this morning that's the right step to take right now. So let's review the bidding in terms of where we are, in terms of all of the different federal aid that's been proposed and disposed as of right now, starting with this multi-billion-dollar package that passed the House of Representatives and was signed into law last week. We had the $8.5 billion for vaccines and R&D. That's already done. Now the phase 2 effort, which is about $105 billion just in sick leave and unemployment, that passed the House, still underway in the Senate. There's some objections in the Senate. Senators are working through that. They hope to have a vote on that one today. The phase 3, this is up to $1 trillion or $1.2 trillion. That's the ask that Secretary Mnuchin made yesterday up on Capitol Hill. The Senate is going to be working on that next. That is still TBD. And then also there's what we can call a phase 4 here. Last night, the White House asked Congress for additional resources for federal agencies. That's $45.8 billion in that request. So a lot of money going out the door already and a lot of money on the way. That's where things stand now. And guys, of course, we've been talking about all through the morning, that's different and side by side with all of the actions that the Federal Reserve has been taking, as Steve Leisman has been updating us throughout the day, Carl.
Eamon, thank you. Interesting. It's hard to keep track with the policies, Jim, which, as Eamon suggested, don't change by the day. They change by the hour.
Patchwork, minuscule, not thinking big enough, thinking the way that this country thought before World War II, not scolding anyone. This obviously is bigger. But, you want to feed, house, and clothe 100 million people. You don't talk about TAF, and you don't talk about commercial paper. All those things are very important. We want to make sure that nothing freezes up. We want to make sure that the banks are solvent. You make the credit lines available, and the Federal Reserve just issues a statement, right? Again, I want some statements. How about something like at 11 o'clock where the Federal Reserve says with the president, or the 11:30, they all get together and say, look, here's the things that aren't going to happen. The banking system, a la what Ben Bernanke said, it's not going to go down. Ben Bernanke with an excellent piece in the Financial Times with Janet Yellen saying, listen, the Federal Reserve has to buy corporates. There's a fantastic article by my old friend Peter Eavis, New York Times, and some other people talking about the size of the corporate market. So the Federal Reserve is saying, listen, we're going to buy any and all corporates. And remember, they're going to make a bargain. Because once they buy them, they're going to go up in value. So the Federal Reserve issues that, saying, you know what, we're going to do what Bernanke and Yellen said. We're going to buy all the corporates you want. As a matter of fact, we're 62 bid for something that's worth 90. All right? But if 10 million size, or maybe 100 million size, or maybe $1 billion size. And then the other side, Secretary Mnuchin says, you know what, 1.2 trillion, we didn't mean to be that granular. We're going to give you what the people need to be able to live on a paycheck with money from the federal government until we solve this or get to where the Federal Express said China is and Starbucks China is. And then the president says, you know what, Manhattan Project, we are going to solve this disease. In the meantime, we're going to continue with the hiatus of business. And then we're fine. I mean, we're fine in the sense that the center holds, and that's kind of what we want, is the center to hold.
Right. I mean, rhetorically, that's where we've been headed the last 24 hours. Mnuchin saying now's not the time to worry about the deficit. There was a spokesman for Speaker Pelosi yesterday who said that Powell told her Congress is, quote, enabled to think fiscally big. So it doesn't seem like there are roadblocks at this point, fiscally.
I want to think big enough. Once again, I'm going to say it to Mr. President and to Treasury Secretary Mnuchin and to Fed Chairman Chairman Powell. All of them I know. Guys, we're going to look back. And no one is going to say, well, you know what? I can't believe how much money they took down for the 100 million workers. What were they thinking? No one is going to say that. No one. This is their time. We'll look back and we'll say they either thought big or they went home.
Right. I mean, Jim, if somebody were to say to you, you have the chance to avoid 20% or more unemployment, you would do anything.
Right.
It doesn't matter.
look, I mean, if you want to put it in the way, we can appease every constituency. We spend that in order to make it so China's not the only world power, and it's a unipower world. We spend that in order to make it so that the fabric of America is saved. We spend that in order to make it so that our country is unified and there is no sort of, yes, insurrection that could occur. Who knows? Put it any way you want to. But I come back and I say, David and Carl, this is your chance to say, you know what, the center's going to hold because we're big thinkers and we're not going to let the unthinkable happen because we are one nation. One nation. I mean, I would read the darn Pledge of Allegiance if I had to, just to be able to be sure that there's enough money for everybody. Next week, our individual charitable contributions to workers we like because we're well off is going to be, okay, when does the federal government take over for the hairstylist and for the waitress? Well, the drive-through person at Yum. When does the federal government say, you know what, that person is entitled to a meal until we solve this? And that's what has to go on. And, look, the shareholders, we want to make the credit work, and we can always talk about whatever facilities necessary. But we need to think FDR, not TAF.
Jim, holding on to 20K. Let's get to Bob Bassani, see what's happening on the floor. Morning, Bob.
And the most important thing is no circuit breakers this morning. A slightly different tone, a little concern at the open, but we never hit those circuit breakers. Just put that on. Remember, 7%, didn't get near there right now. It's sort of down about, as you saw, roughly 6%. That level 1 halt, 7%, not there yet. So let's just move on and show you the main thing that everyone was concerned about this morning. Everything was down. So if you look, for example, at corporate bonds, put up the next screen, you look at corporate bonds. This is LQD. We're down. Corporate bonds down. S&P 500, the SPDR ETF, that's down. Crude oil's down. Gold's down. Everything down here. That implies, of course, people are simply moving to the sidelines and gathering cash. That's an issue down here. Sectors, we're continuing to see some small bifurcation, as we used to say. Consumer staples still down, notably healthcare down. Utilities even down even more. Industrials down 7.5%. So yes, a little bit of differentiation, but let's not get too crazy about it. The overall market is still down. 2 or 3% differences between the highest and the lowest ones. Boeing here, of course, big concern over in the Dow here. Broke 100 briefly just a few moments ago. But remember, Boeing's talking about seeking access to $60 billion in public and private liquidity for the aerospace industry. Boeing's market cap is now below $60 billion. It's probably at this level, maybe $57, $58 billion, somewhere around there. Rather remarkable just to see what Boeing's been doing recently. S&P 500, just want to remind everybody from our cash in a little while ago, several weeks ago, 2351. That was the old December 24th, 2018 low that we see. We have not touched that, but we have gotten awfully close several times. There's not much technicals out there to look for, but that's sort of the main one that everybody is looking at. Curiously, a lot of analysts are still in the upgrade and downgrade business. You'd think, would this really matter? But no, they're still out there. Walmart got an upgrade today, another one from Credit Suisse. They may grow their market share. Kroger got an upgrade at Telsey Group, talking about a surge in demand for food. O'Reilly Auto upgraded over at Goldman Sachs. Counter-cyclicality of auto parts business. Ralph Lauren also got an upgrade at B of A. Downside largely priced in. Dunkin' Brands upgraded over at BTIG. There also are some downgrades, and pay attention to that. Of course, we saw the big, some good strength here in Coca-Cola recently. Monster Beverage downgraded over at Morgan Stanley. Mandated closures for businesses and restrictions on public gatherings, a problem for these. So the debate now is very simple. What are we still in? Is this a U-shape? Is it an L-shaped recovery? Most people are not big on using V-shaped anymore. The L-shape seems to be very much in control of the narrative right now here. And of course, there's some question about whether or not we're going to need bigger bazookas out there, to put it mildly. The L-shaped recovery, if you have critical economic relationships that may be disrupted longer term, particularly in small business. Jeffrey is a very good example here, quoting, of course, what we saw in Jaws. We're going to need a bigger boat. So a lot of questions about, even with the current programs, whether we're going to see additional ones on top of them. But I think it's very encouraging here, Carl, the somewhat quieter response of the market, not at the moment, not hitting the circuit breakers. Markets did open a little more orderly as well. There were much less delays in some of the openings here. So up and running a lot quicker here. Guys, back to you.
Bob. Yeah, hey, Bob, it's David. You
Hi, David.
spend your days a lot of times, obviously, talking to trading desks. What are you hearing in terms of a situation we've never encountered before, where we've got people either working from remote locations or many working from home? What are you hearing in terms of the ability to trade, settlements, fails, and things of that nature? Is this going okay, or is it encountering some issues?
Well, you know, the thing I've been watching carefully is the market plumbing, what we call market structure. Is everyone able to get the trades through? Are we able to get the settlement? And the system has worked remarkably well. Now, there have been some flashpoints, but remember, they made some big changes several years ago in response to the flash crash. For example, they upgraded, the SEC required systems upgrades, regular testing. The system overall is more robust than it was 10 years ago. And I think that is showing through. Regulation called Reg SCI that the SEC implemented with all the exchanges. You have to upgrade. You have to regularly stress test the systems. This happened in the last 10 years, and I think it's made a difference. There has been some modest dislocations in some of the ETFs, for example, some of the corporate bond and bond ETFs recently. There's been some differences in the net asset value towards what people are willing to pay and what are being priced. But that's simply because the ETF business allows people to trade without trading the underlying securities. So, for example, the SPY, the SPDR, this is the largest ETF. 90% of the time, the SPY trades without any of the underlying securities, the S&P 500, actually changing hands underneath that. So individuals can trade without actually trading the underlyings. You could do that in the bond market as well. Sometimes you get some mispricings in the last few days, but that tends to narrow as things kind of calm down. So in terms of the trading desk, yeah, people are worried about the fact that a lot of people aren't in. And down here at the NYSE as well, this has been an issue hotly discussed in the last few days. But in terms of the market structure, most of it seems to still be working pretty well. David?
All right, Bob, I'll take it. Thank you, Bob Pisani. Dollar index above 100. Let's get to Rick Santelli. Good morning, Rick.
Wow, you're going in reverse. I was going to get to the dollar index, but since you brought it up, we haven't closed above 100 since about tax day 2017, so mid-April 2017. Let's start at the top. You know, housing starts and permits were down a little bit. But what did I say? They are really lofty. Let's look at 15-year charts of both. You know, they're in the zip code of some of the best numbers basically in 13 years. Yes, they've turned down a bit, but they've turned down from upwardly revised numbers in previous months. So those are really two pretty-looking charts. Now let's look at what's going on in the Treasury market. You know, obviously curve steepening is wild, is the long end really powering ahead. You know, if you're going to have a lot of deficits, and I get all the reasons why we need to. Maybe the Treasury market is waking up to that, especially the long end. Ultra bonds yesterday were limit down as sales came in, pushing yields up. You know, we have initial jobless claims. We extended them in the 2007-2008 crisis. Starting to buy corporates, talk about these things. Market's going to get a bit nervous. Didn't really work out well for Japan and Europe. But, hey, well, let's see how it goes. Look at it March 9th. And I picked March 9th because Monday, March 9th is when we made all the historic intraday lows across the entire yield curve, pretty much on every fixed income product that has to do with sovereign. So if you look at 2-year, you can see that they have traded not through the high yields, which are around 55. We haven't done that. But as you go down the curve, look at what happens to 10-year. We've definitely traded above. As a matter of fact, right before our time zone started officially, we traded up close to 122 in a 10. In 30 years, we've traded up a bit as well. So the long end steepening, and it happens both with prices going down lately because the long end is really starting to power ahead. Now, let's look at what's going on with regard to 10s minus 2s. Here it sits at what now? 62 and change. It's the steepest in basically 2 years. Let's see what's going on overseas. Yesterday, I put a chart up, Boons versus Italian 10s, 10s to 10s in Europe. I even put up the French ones. Now, you see that line coming up on the right? You really need to pay attention to that. Because what's going on is Boon yields are actually starting to go down. They're narrowing with regard to the spread to the U.S. But with other governments in Europe, it is definitely widening. That is a credit issue to pay attention to. Very quickly, dollar index, there it is, 3-year chart. We haven't been at these levels since basically March, April 2017. Carl, Jim, David, back to you.
All right, Rick, we'll talk to you in a bit. Facebook has gone from 200 to 143 in about 3 weeks. Sheryl Sandberg talked to Jim last night about how the company's changing the way they do business.
We're very close to small businesses. 140 million use our platform, you know, platforms all over the world. And we work with them every day. And we heard directly from them that they were in need, very nervous, not able to pay a lot of their employees and worried their doors were shut. So we're working around the clock to help as much as we can.
All right, Jim, that's the kind of corporate behavior that you're applauding today.
Right, we're looking for public and private. We want to rally private. We want to rally private citizens, too. It's just that the federal government is so much bigger than everybody. Sheryl Sandberg doing her part, trying to invest in the companies that have used them and done great, and maybe keep them, give them a lifeline. But I do think that what we need is, as much as we need the Canadian border sealed, whatever, but we need to hear what we'll do for the working people in order to make sure that the center does hold and the blood-dimmed tide is not loose. And I do think that in terms of weapons, we got to start thinking about little boy, because that's what dropped on Hiroshima, and that's what we needed. So let's keep that in mind.
Yeah. Surgeon General David on the Today Show this morning, starting to turn a corner, and people really are getting the message. It's because it's starting to affect people who they see and know. That's the kind of behavior change we are looking for.
You know, every incremental piece of news we hear that actually speaks to the virus being slowed in its spread is good news, Carl. But again, we got to wait for the numbers themselves. And everything's going to be a little wacky given testing is increasing. And so we're going to find a lot of cases that have not been in the current count. But yeah, that is something that we can look at least with the hope that we can get to the other side more quickly without, of course, as we've been saying, overwhelming the healthcare system. That's what we desperately want to avoid. All the experts will tell you we don't want to have the tragedy that's going on in Italy.
Jim, let's do stop trading.
Boy, is that ever right, David? It's Coca-Cola. It's really downgraded. Coca-Cola's a safe haven, but they're talking about how at this point, it isn't. That maybe the bottlers need money, the convenience store companies maybe not doing the business that they thought. And so now you have a company that we know, this is a good example, we know it's going to come out on the other side. So the question is, do you bet on science and say, you know what, I'm going to buy Coca-Cola with 4% yield? Or do you bet on the Grim Reaper and Stephen King and say, I don't want to own that? I'm still going to go with the scientist versus Stephen King.
All right, Jim, what's on that?
Can I just say, this is important for David. David knows my sister Nan, and she does say, David has a nice apartment, much better than most who come on remotely. Where does he live?
Everybody wants to know that.
I mean, obviously, David,
yeah, well, this is...
You look great.
I'm very lucky. I'm at my remote location, and I did wear a tie for you, Jim, as you know. I only have one here, so you guys may start to see this tie more regularly, or perhaps tomorrow I have one jacket, so I'll put that on. But thank you.
I may have to. I have a great-looking office, David. I may have to duel you. I don't know. In the meantime, we got Logitech tonight on. That's a competitor to Zoom. You know, people, as David shows you, people are using their home office. I don't know whether David has Zoom, whether he has Logitech, whether he has WebEx. And then Starbucks. Let's find out what they're doing. And I think it'll be interesting to talk about the buyback in light of what Mark Cuban's talking about. There's a rebellion against buybacks unless you're a shareholder.
Jim, we'll see you tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks as always. I'm Jim Cramer.
All right.
Good Wednesday morning. Welcome back to Squawk on the Street. I'm Carl Quintanilla with Mike Santoli, David Faber, all coming to you live from separate locations as we take precautions with social distancing due to the spread of the coronavirus. Dow's down 1,000 points or so, 22, let's say. We were down 1339 at the early lows. No circuit breakers today. U.S.-Canada border has been closed to non-essential trade. We'll get details from that, we think, a little bit later from the president. I'll check in with Mike Santoli really quick here, Mike, and get your radar to start this Wednesday morning.
Yeah, Carl, I mean, I guess you take it as a small net positive that the actual cash indexes did not go down that 5% for long that the futures indicated. We're still so close to those December 2018 lows. I don't think that specific levels are what this is about. It's about whether we see new waves of selling intensity based on what's going on in the non-equity markets. Still very unsettled in fixed income land, but I do think there's some hope that some of these Fed measures, just backstopping primary dealers and things like that, might in fact grease the gears a little bit. So I think we're still on that treadmill watching those things.
David, you as hopeful?
You know, there seems to be at least some stability right now in terms of the S&P. And as you guys know, I'm keeping an eye on the credit markets as well, where so much activity potentially could take place. Very little has. But companies that are in a position to raise cash certainly are being advised to do so. And, you know, yesterday we saw Exxon and Verizon and Pepsi. I mentioned that in the last hour, Carl. Not sure we're going to see many hit the investment grade market today. But there is at least a sense of some, I don't want to even call it stability. Let's wait for the next headline at this point. But that something big may be coming, a la what Jim was talking about, of course, for that last hour.
All right, guys, let's bring in Mark Zandi this morning, Moody Analytics chief economist on the CNBC phone line, and David Lebovitz, a global market strategist at JP Morgan Asset Management. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time today. It's good to see you.
Thank you.
David, what do we do with the continued calls from macro desks? Goldman's a good example today, reaffirming their view that a mid-year low is S&P 2K, but you end the year at 3,200. I mean, how valuable are these pieces of forecast right now?
So, you know, when we think about putting a level on the end of the year, I think it's a guessing game, and it's anybody's best guess at this juncture. You know, one of the things that we've been most focused on in trying to figure out where the low may be and where the ever-elusive fair value may lie is thinking about, you know, what's the right multiple to put on equities, and then importantly, what's the right earnings number? And I think that's something very different from, say, December 2018 when earnings estimates didn't really move around all that much. You're finally beginning to see earnings come under pressure here, and there are questions around how low earnings estimates for this year will go. I think the key thing for investors is to look through, right, is to understand that eventually at some point the market will start to look through what's happening with the virus and price in a virus-free run rate. And to me, that's what we really need to see in order for markets to find some stability.
And that'll be based on a second derivative of caseload? Any doubt about that?
So, you know, I think that it's very closely tied to the growth rate that we see, and you know, the exponential growth that we're seeing obviously suggests to me that markets probably have some downside from current levels. But, you know, at some point, and I would agree, you know, the middle of the year, if you think about the pace at which this virus has grown, if everybody in the world to get it, they would have it by the month of July. So kind of that worst case scenario plays out by the middle of the year. Hopefully at that point you begin to see things, more normal activity start to get priced in.
All right, Mark, let's talk to you about interim solutions. That's going to be the topic of discussion for weeks to come, and with time obviously of the essence. What are you making of some of the reports about worst case forecasts for unemployment starting in Q2?
Are you referring to the 20% unemployment rate?
I mean, I think the reporting around that has been messy, but yes.
I think that's an overstatement. I mean, the unemployment rate peaked at 10% on the nose in the financial crisis. But, I don't know that it makes much difference if it's 20% or 10%. It's really, really bad. So if that's what it takes, if it's that kind of conversation that it takes to get Congress to move and the administration to move towards a package of stimulus, both in terms of getting cash into the hands of households and small business in particular, and also helping to make sure that credit continues to flow in the fixed income markets, that's fine. I do think they need to be on high alert and get moving here, and if it takes that kind of number to get them moving, I'm all for it.
Mark, the general sense out there has been that whatever fiscal measures we get obviously are going to be intended as a bridge to when we can get back to something closer to a normal economy. And the thinking is, look, the economy was in pretty good shape without significant imbalances or acute vulnerabilities going into this crisis. Does that change the longer this goes on? In other words, can we have wear and tear on the fundamentals of the economy? What would you be looking for in that regard?
Yeah, I never agreed with that narrative, Mike. The economy wasn't strong coming into this. It was on its back heels. That trade war did a lot of damage. Manufacturing, transportation, distribution, agriculture were all in recession. We were barely growing enough to maintain the low unemployment rate. So, I don't think we were that strong coming in. The Fed cut interest rates 3 times last year. That's not consistent with a well-functioning, healthy economy. So, and then to your other point, as long as the economy and the financial markets remain under this kind of stress, the odds of something else happening, something else breaking in the credit markets, for example, rises. So it's very important, critical, that Congress and the administration at this point come together, big stimulus package. Also they have to come up with something with regard to making sure that there's still credit flowing into the economy. So I think that's going to require some support from Treasury in combination with the Federal Reserve. They've got to do those things pretty quickly so these stresses don't completely undermine things and something else breaks.
Yeah, well, Mark, we've been talking about that in the last hour, the need to get the money to businesses who will then guarantee employment for their workers in businesses in particular that are being hard hit, though many are, and conceivably would be laying those people off. It's a fairly complex problem. Is it your sense that we will be able to get there given the input you need from Treasury, from our political leaders, from Congress, and everybody else?
Yeah, I think so. I think what we need is a much larger credit facility seeded by the Treasury. The Treasury puts up the equity, gets the Fed to participate, and it backstops the banking system in particular so that the banks have a way to continue to lend to their business borrowers. They can continue to extend those lines of credit and other loans and hopefully reach down and help some of these smaller businesses that are going to have some, obviously have a great deal of difficulty here. So it's going to take more than this, the Fed here. It's, I think, going to take the Treasury, and we need a much larger, more creative credit facility. And I suspect they're, I know they're working on that, and I think that's something that will come to fruition.
David, given such a wide gap between what we might call best and worst case scenarios, even over the next few months in terms of the macroeconomic story, I wonder, as you look at various capital markets as an investor, are we waiting for that moment when we find some bedrock levels of value that, you don't necessarily have to have a view for a rapid recovery or even a recovery much this year? I wonder where you would place that along the lines of, what you would tell an investor to do long term. S&P already down almost 30%. Does that reflect anything like long-term value surfacing?
So I do think we are getting to a point where long-term value is going to start to show up. And, I think the important thing to recognize and kind of, launching off of Mark's comments about what needs to be done by the Fed and the Treasury and so on and so forth, I think we are undoubtedly now looking at a period of interest rates that are going to be lower for longer. That is going to make high-quality fixed income less attractive and risk assets over time more attractive. And, I think what is so interesting about the virus situation and everything with COVID-19 is that, this is transitory. There is light at the end of the tunnel. There are just questions around how long the tunnel actually is. So we do believe that value is being created. Even some of the higher quality sectors, things like technology, are beginning to look quite attractive from where we sit. And importantly, when things do begin to bounce back, and I do believe that things will bounce back sometime this year, that's going to be led by things like financials, the more cyclical parts of the economy, which are undoubtedly looking extremely cheap at the current juncture. So I do think that value is being created both in absolute terms as well as relative to what's happening within fixed income.
That's a good point, David. I wonder, speaking of value being created, I have started to see some technicians, at least, looking at charts, trying to argue that the damage in small caps argues for a bounce, let's say, relative to what the NDX might do in the coming weeks. So how much faith do you put in that?
I think the small cap situation is complicated. If you look at the Russell 2000, a third of those companies have negative earnings. And I think we're still in a period where we haven't seen kind of peak virus in places like the United States. That to me means that investors are going to continue to lean into quality. But importantly, markets are forward looking. So, likely before things get their worst here in the U.S. and the Western world more broadly, I think you will see things like small cap begin to accelerate, but a little bit early from where I sit at the current.
I see. Finally, Mark, let's be honest and talk about what kinds of numbers we might be seeing on the next NFP print.
Well, it's not going to show. It's going to show up a little bit on that print because that is based on we're talking about the non-farm payrolls. That is that survey is based on last week. So last week we were only really people were really getting their minds around what the implications of this were. And I think what happened last week is businesses stopped hiring, but they had not started to lay off workers. So the number we're going to get is going to be a soft number, but I don't think it may not even be a negative number. But since then, obviously, we're now in full-blown layoff mode. So the next number we get a month from now will show the full force of this, and I think it's going to be, obviously, a big negative number.
Yep. And as we get reports of statewide claims, when would we expect jobless claims to start reflecting some of the high-frequency pain now?
Not this week, so tomorrow we're going to get a UI, initial claims from unemployment insurance number, but that's for 2 weeks ago. And again, I don't think businesses were laying off until this week. So it won't be, really into next week and the week after when we're really going to start to see that jump.
Okay. Guys, thank you for helping our viewers understand where we are in this whole process. We'll see you soon. I'm Mark and David.
Thanks, guys.
Shares of Boeing continuing to plunge, on pace for its worst month ever, with the company now seeking billions in aid. Our Phil LeBeau has the latest on the company. Phil.
Mike, a fair number of questions about exactly what Boeing is asking from the federal government. And let me give you a rundown in terms of where things stood at the end of yesterday. But these are fluid conversations in Washington. At least $60 billion in aid. Now, that would not all go strictly to Boeing and be Boeing's alone. It basically is Boeing's request for itself, as well as the entire aviation industry, all of its suppliers. And this is separate from the airline request. Remember, the airlines are asking for anywhere between $50 and $58 billion. Boeing has drawn down the $13.8 billion term loan that they took out just a month ago. So that gives you some indication of how quickly this company is burning through its cash. And as we've talked with analysts throughout the day, they pointed out it's not the money that they're burning through right now. It's what they might burn through over the next couple of months, especially as they see airlines either deferring deliveries or just simply saying, no, we don't want a delivery at all. By the way, Boeing also has access to other credit lines. And as you mentioned, Mike, Boeing is on pace right now for its worst month ever, down more than 65% this month. But again, this is a fluid situation in Washington in terms of the discussions between Boeing and the people on Capitol Hill, as well as the Trump administration.
Phil, it feels like the moment you talked to Gary Kelly, where was that? Was that in D.C. About a week or two ago?
A week ago.
And he said it had a 9/11 feel. Sounded jarring at the moment. Ended up on the front page of the Times the next morning. Now you have executives like JetBlue saying the quote writing is on the wall that travel will not return soon. So this came in the news really quickly.
The letter from Robin Hayes today spelled it out clearly, Carl. On an average day in March, let's say last year, they were bringing in $22 million. The average so far every day this month, less than $4 million. The cancellations are soaring. People are not flying. Something has to be done to help the airline industry one way or the other, or else you're going to see these guys quickly slide closer and closer towards bankruptcy.
Phil,
hey, Phil,
don't go too far.
It's funny.
Oh, go ahead, Mike.
It's actually me, Carl.
David.
Phil, during the financial crisis, I ended up focusing a lot of my time on AIG, which became, obviously, as we know, crucially important. And the government did eventually come to its aid after it lost about $100 billion in a quarter. It seems in some ways similar to the situation that Boeing finds itself in right now. I don't know how quickly this is going to move. I mean, timing would seem to be of the essence. You have indicated that. Do you have any sense in terms of both management and government, in terms of how focused they are in getting something done near term?
Yes. From my discussions with executives at Boeing, they want it done very quickly. Not simply because, people say, well, of course they want it done quickly. Every company wants their money. That's not the situation here. This is a case where they are burning through cash, not only right now, but when you look out over the next couple of months, they're going to be burning through a lot of cash. So then the question becomes, they've already committed, David, to keeping the 10,000 workers at Renton plant where they build the 737 MAX. They committed when they shut down production to continue paying them. Right. They'll find other work within the company. They'll make sure that those people are not laid off. Well, now you're getting to the point where Boeing is going to say, look, we have a choice to make here. Do we continue paying these people or do we lay them off? And as you were talking with Jim earlier today, I mean, they are the largest employer in terms of, companies in this country. And so you look at the prospect here, if you're Boeing, of at some point, very quickly, the call is going to have to be made. Either we get this aid lined up, or we're going to have to start making some choices that nobody's going to want to see, starting with layoffs. And then also the conversation will shift towards, does Boeing start considering things like a bankruptcy?
Right. Thanks,
Phil, thank you. Guys, as we're talking, McConnell on the tape, just to keep everybody up to date, says we will not adjourn the Senate until a far bolder coronavirus bill is passed. The Senate will vote, he thinks, on the House virus bill today. We'll watch D.C. Meantime, the NIH out with a new study on the potential airborne transmission of the coronavirus. Meg Terrell's on the CNBC Newsline with the latest. Morning, Meg.
Well, good morning, Carl. This is a study that was published last night in the New England Journal of Medicine. And what it did was essentially look at the SARS-CoV-2 virus, that's the virus that causes COVID-19, and kind of compared it to how it looks to the original SARS virus. And what they found is it's very similar in terms of how long it can live in various or survive in various circumstances. They said it appears to be stable for several hours to days in aerosols and on surfaces. And just to really put that into context for people, this is not scientists now. This is airborne like a virus like measles, where you cough in a hallway and then somebody walks through hours later and can catch the virus that way. This is not what they're talking about. They are finding typically in terms of aerosols, the virus can survive or is stable for up to 3 hours. But in the circumstances in the study, these were experimentally generated aerosols. Scientists saying SARS viruses don't normally form aerosols on their own, only really in hospital procedures like bronchoscopy and intubation. So this is not something you're talking about being sort of a widespread thing. In terms of other surfaces, copper up to 4 hours, cardboard up to 24 hours, plastic and stainless steel up to 2 to 3 days. Some of the takeaways for this, for us in the general public, reminders, wipe down surfaces, doorknobs, counters. Obviously, wash your hands, don't touch your face. When we're thinking about the aerosolized version of this, crowded surfaces, obviously. But what researchers are saying is that the takeaway in terms of the aerosols is probably mostly for healthcare workers. And already we've heard from the CDC and increasingly the WHO that healthcare workers should be taking precautions to avoid the spread through the air. Guys, I'm sure that this can be sort of disturbing news, thinking about this being airborne, but really they're saying this is similar to the original SARS virus, and so the difference in the way that these viruses are spreading is probably explained by other factors, including the potential for this virus to be spread before people recognize symptoms.
Meg, as you're talking, Axios with a piece quoting an HHS official and another source with direct knowledge that pharma company Bayer will make a large donation to the government of a drug that has shown some promise in helping patients suffering from the novel virus. As you're watching Gilead, Regeneron, and some of the others in terms of therapeutics, who's in pole position? Who are you watching the most?
Well, watching all of them because it's really all shots on goal that are important right now. And I've actually heard the same thing that will, that donation. That's a drug called chloroquine, which is a malaria drug. There have been some studies saying that it could potentially be helpful. We don't know yet because there haven't been broader studies done. Gilead's drug remdesivir, I've talked to experts who say there is reason to expect that could work. The WHO, of course, saying that a few weeks ago it looked to be the only drug that was helping. We'll see that data in just a few weeks in April. We're really looking forward to seeing that data. And of course, yesterday, Regeneron saying that they have started their study in New York already of their existing rheumatoid arthritis drug, Kevzara, which could be helpful for the most severe patients with the lung reactions. So that could be very helpful if it works. And then, of course, their new drug that they're developing, they hope to be in human clinical trials by the beginning of summer. So things moving quickly, and we have to hope some of these nearer-term things work.
Certainly do, Meg. Thank you very much. We'll talk to you again soon. The Bay Area, one of the hardest hit in the country in terms of the coronavirus impact, looking for ways to contain the spread. Stanford Healthcare recently opened up its drive-through coronavirus testing for patients who had been referred there from their medical providers. These patients remain in their vehicles while a physician attends to them. Joining us now with more is the president and CEO at Stanford Healthcare, David Entwistle. David, good to have you with us here. Obviously, a huge concern with this entire crisis has been trying to make sure we have healthcare capacity to treat and test everybody who needs it. What are you doing at your facility specifically? And I guess what volumes are you prepared for at this point? Do you think you have that under control?
Well, first of all, great to be here with you today, and great questions as we think about the uptake of this virus across the country. And certainly there's a lot of concern, there's a lot of anxious people. The healthcare systems here locally, and Santa Clara has been one of the areas that we have seen more uptake than other parts of the country. We've been working very closely with local county officials to make sure that we're doing the right things to be able to be prepared. Not only does that mean internally, as you talked about, we have been able to develop a novel test actually here at Stanford that's allowed us to be able to test COVID patients and actually get results back in 12 to 24 hours, which goes a long way in mitigating some of the fears that patients have coming in. That's allowed us, as you shared, to stand up these drive-through clinics. And actually patients can be screened with their primary provider right online, so they don't have to come in and actually right from their car receive the nasal swab for the test. So there's a lot of things being done. We're planning locally. Certainly concerns with how quickly will this uptake, how quickly will we see patients coming in, but a lot of planning that's taking place with what we're doing both from our general acute care capacity, but also ICU capacity, because as the disease progresses, certainly that becomes one of the areas that we're looking at. And some of our modeling suggests that, of the positive COVID patients, anywhere from 10 to 12% of those could eventually need an ICU bed. And so we want to make sure that that capacity is here, and there's a lot of planning and effort. But as we've seen here locally, there's a steady uptake, and we're not seeing some of those vast uptakes that we've seen in some of the other areas impacted by this virus.
And you've run other large hospital systems. Do you think, holistically speaking, there is the ability to add ICU capacity and stay a step ahead of this? Or do we just not know yet because testing is in such an early phase?
I think, and let me say something about testing too, because I know a lot of folks are anxious about this and, can I just get the test? We want to make sure that we're cautioning folks to follow the CDC guidelines in getting the test, making sure that the viral loads are a point where the test can actually be accurate, we can tell. And so that's certainly something that we've seen here locally that's important. I also sit on the board for the American Hospital Association, and I know there's a lot of tremendous healthcare organizations around the country that are planning and prepping for just that piece. We do have the opportunity to flex, and when we look at what we need to be able to meet the needs, we want to make sure that those are online. Certainly as a county of Santa Clara, there's a lot of prep work that's being done about how do we spread that potentially across the whole system so that we're not just looking at some of the centers like Stanford Medicine to respond to that. But there's a great network of hospitals and healthcare organizations around the country that are doing similar planning.
I wonder, the public's being showered with headlines about the unavailability of tests, but there's other supplies you need in order to conduct those tests. What does the supply chain look like on that front, swabs and so forth?
Sure. No, that's a great question. One of the hot topics, in fact, you've had on your show already today, is to talk about personal protective equipment. One of our highest priorities is to make sure that the healthcare workers that are needed to be able to respond to the patients coming in are protected from that. We are seeing across the country shortages in some of that PPE equipment and the availability. So whether you're looking at masks, whether you're looking at gowns and other things, certainly there's a high utilization of that, and we're certainly taking all opportunities. Some of the areas that we're manufacturing those around the world certainly have not been able to produce some of that. So a lot of great sources out there. As you mentioned, even nasal swabs, some of those that we were using are coming out of Italy, which is being challenged as well. But we're looking at other sources and other manufacturing, and we've seen companies that are actually stepping up their production in other areas that we haven't seen before. So while we continue to receive shipments that are coming in, we certainly are cautiously optimistic that we're going to be able to have the supplies that we need.
We've heard plenty about various, across the healthcare system, people essentially deferring elective procedures and things like that to try and preserve the ability to treat those who need it right now. But in terms of your hospital there, are you able to handle other more urgent needs along with doing what we need to do in terms of testing and treating of the COVID victims?
Great question. I mean, one of the things that we're a tertiary quaternary center here at Stanford Medicine, and we do have some of the best resources in the country. Those continue. People continue to have accidents. They continue to have heart disease. They continue to have cancer, and we've got to be able to create the capacity for that. We have, and if you look at the county here, delayed elective procedures. If those things, without causing harm to the patient, can wait 30 days or more, we've asked those patients to postpone those procedures. And that's going to be an important impact to be able to have the capacity that we need for potential COVID patients that need to be inpatient, but at the same time making sure that we're treating those diseases that are progressing and need to be cared for. Unfortunately, the healthcare in many cases won't stop. And if all of those things are delayed, then you are creating a bolus that will actually build up in the system, and it's going to be difficult to manage. So we want to make sure that as a community resources, we feel a moral obligation to be there for our patients and to make sure that we're providing the services that they need, while at the same time being able to respond to issues like COVID.
David, thank you very much for your thoughts this morning. David Entwistle, Stanford Health.
Thank you for the time.
I want to bring in Tom Michaud now from KPW, of course, a frequent guest of ours, to talk bank stocks. And Tom, looking at the bank sector this morning, it's, well, similar to the carnage that we've seen throughout the rest of the market, even worse perhaps, again today. We know interest rates being low for an extended period of time may not be the best for banks, but is there also just a concern overall in terms of the credit quality of given the declining financial fortunes of so many corporations in the United States?
David, there is a lot of concern. We're getting reports back, really, I think, of unprecedented slowdown and shutdown of businesses. So I think it is of a concern. Our approach to how we think about this is that we don't think we have enough information to figure out exactly what's going to happen. So what we've been doing is we've been stress testing it, and we've been looking at scenarios. And our opinion is that what happens over the next couple of months is going to be very manageable for the banking industry. We think what we're looking at right now is really somewhat of an earnings crisis, not a balance sheet crisis for the banking industry. We've already seen how banks have shut off their buybacks. We think their dividends are still going to be paid. This may cost them a good portion of their year's earnings, but we think, broadly speaking, for the banking industry, that they've got the capital and the balance sheet to be able to handle what's going to be coming at us over the next couple of months.
Well, if that is the case, then one would expect that you would think you need to be brave and buy the stocks. Is that the case? When I look at a Wells Fargo down 47% or a Citi down 54%, these are year-to-date numbers, by the way, or a JP Morgan down 37%. Is it time, in your opinion, given that what you just shared, to actually buy some of these stocks?
I do believe that. And by the way, what I've been telling clients and colleagues is cheap stocks can get cheaper. And the technicals aren't good for the banks. If you even look at Monday, it was the biggest ETF flow day of the year into broad-based ETFs with over $9 billion, but financials had an outflow. So the technicals are terrible, and that could continue. But my opinion is that if you're an investor and look out beyond this, and we keep comparing this to the global financial crisis, we think that buying the trophies that are on sale or the better companies at these prices, if you can withstand the volatility, that our view is that the banking industry is in good shape, and we're going to be figuring out in the coming week what our earnings estimates are going to change to. But we think that most of the dividends, almost all the dividends, will probably be good, and we think that the balance sheets will remain intact. So the answer to your question is yes, we would, but also, you know, there are companies that may have more than average exposure to certain areas of energy or others. Those will probably not do as well as those that are a little bit more national or broad in scope. But we do think that some of these stocks are highly attractive.
You know, Tom, there is a broad expectation that the Treasury and the government is going to come up with some sort of way to aid so many companies and encourage them to keep their workers. But if that doesn't happen, and if we get to this idea of, let's call it a 15% or 20% unemployment rate, as apparently the Treasury Secretary at least expressed to some GOP senators, have you stress tests for that? I mean, can the
banking crisis like you did, again, back in the 08 to 2010, we haven't stress tested 20% unemployment, but the banks are in a very good position, and I think this may be a situation where we're seeing unprecedented government, well, not unprecedented, we'd had a lot of government support in the prior crisis, but that crisis almost started with a banking crisis. That's not the case right here. And we think if these government support programs keep rolling out like they're being talked about, I think that's going to come to the aid of the economy, which will help the banks.
Tom, I'm wondering what you make of this sort of collective action among some of the very large financial institutions. One, to agree to cease buying back stock, and then two, to make that gesture of going to the discount window at the Fed and making use of that. Now we have these other facilities. The Fed is announcing allowing primary dealers in government bonds to pledge almost any type of securities and get very inexpensive loans from the Fed off of that. Do you see banks utilizing that to the fullest, or there's still going to be some reluctance for them to free up their balance sheets in those ways?
I think banks are going to use it, and I think some of the best performing banks in the nation are going to use it quickly and probably tell other people about it to make sure it's destigmatized. And look about what I think we need to do. I think most people believe that this is temporary in nature if it's held appropriately. We need to get this virus behind us and think about where interest rates are. Interest rates are zero or near zero. If we can, so the interest expense is not great. We need to have the banks and we need to have the regulatory flexibility to give the banks the opportunity to delay principal payments so we can get beyond this period. It could be manageable if all the forces come together between government, and I like the fact that you talked about a collective nature, because in my conversations with CEOs, that's how they're thinking. They would like to do that.
Tom, always appreciate your taking some time for us. Thank you.
Thank you. Good luck. Thank you. Be well.
David, Mike, as you've been talking, two things. Narrowest intraday range in about a week for the S&P, 5.1%. And Walmart, all-time high, 126.05. Dow's down 967. Let's get a coronavirus update. Sue Herrera has that for us back at HQ. Hi, Sue.
Hello, Carl. Hello, everyone. Here's the latest numbers. The number of global coronavirus cases has surged once again. It is now at more than 204,000. The death toll has risen above 8,200. Iran alone is reporting 14 new deaths since yesterday, raising its total to 1,135 dead. Here in the U.S., there are nearly 6,500 confirmed cases, with the virus now in all 50 states after West Virginia reported its first case yesterday. The European Central Bank president reportedly telling European leaders lockdowns being imposed to fight the coronavirus could easily shrink the EU's economy by 5%. A German newspaper says that is based on each month of lockdown, reducing economic growth by 2.1%. And those lockdowns are estimated to last for 3 months. Back here at home, the virus outbreak has caused an estimated 3,600 job cuts, counting layoffs announced by big employers. Challenger Grain Christmas says slowing demand is already starting to shrink employment, and that number does not include layoffs from smaller employers such as bars and restaurants, which have all been shut down. And Challenger Gray says those cuts are affecting millions of workers. So we're monitoring the numbers for you, Carl, and I'll have it for you next hour. Back to you.
All right, Sue, thank you. Sue Herrera. Biopharma companies and medical scientists all around the world are racing to develop a vaccine for COVID-19, with worldwide cases now crossing 200,000. Pharma companies coming together at a scale. Really, you got to go back to the Ebola outbreak to see something like this. And with us in a CNBC exclusive this morning is the chairman and CEO of Merck, Ken Frazier, who's at the front lines of this fight, along with CNBC contributor and former Medtronic CEO, Bill George. Gentlemen, it is great to see you. Ken, it's been a while. Good morning to you as well.
It's good to be here.
We saw the note earlier in the week from you and BioNTech teaming up to develop this vaccine. Can you bring viewers up to speed on what you're doing?
So I think actually you're thinking about another arrangement, but I think what we are doing inside Merck is we are bringing to bear all of our experience and our expertise in developing vaccines. You just mentioned Ebola. We were able to get an Ebola virus vaccine across the finish line in terms of demonstrating it was safe and effective and getting the regulatory approvals and being able to scale up. So we know what it takes to get a vaccine across the finish line in a public health emergency.
Yeah, you're right. It is Pfizer. My apologies. But more broadly, though, Ken, how much good wood has already been chopped in developing some of these things, given the past episodes that we've been through?
Well, I think that we have a lot of expertise, but let's remember that this is a novel coronavirus that we hadn't heard about until last December. So a lot of work has to be done to understand the virus. The good thing for a company like Merck is we have a lot of expertise with, for example, antivirals, HIV, Hep C, other areas. We have a vast library. Continue to test those assets to see if any of them have effectiveness against this particular coronavirus. But if I could just take a moment, I think while that's an important thing in the industry, all across the industry, you have many biomedical researchers trying to look for therapeutics as well as vaccines. I think it's important to reiterate, with the unprecedented spread of this particular virus, a doubling around the world in the last 2 weeks, we are the first line of defense with respect to our own hygiene, washing our hands, in terms of social distancing. The second line of defense are all those healthcare providers, doctors, nurses, and community volunteers who are helping affected people. And then the industry has really swung into action with a lot of biomedical researchers dropping what they were doing to ensure that we actually are focusing on this issue.
Indeed. I saw a picture of a healthcare worker today with a sign saying, "I stayed at work, so you can stay at home." That's really where we are. Bill, I want to bring you in, given your expertise, and ask you what you think is important, and then have you ask Ken what you guys together think is important.
Well, I think we're working very hard to get a vaccine, but I think we need to be realistic here. We're looking at least a year, could be 12, could be 15 to 18 months. Moderna had the first human trial, but we don't know. That's an mRNA trial. We just don't know how it's going to work, and healthy patients will see. And I think we have an amazing medical capacity and companies like Merck, the greatest pharmaceutical company in the world, but with their science. But I think we've got to, people are working together to try to develop something, but I think we have a little note of caution about get something too quickly. And meanwhile, we have to defend, as Ken said, we have to depend upon our healthcare workers. My son and daughter-in-law are both doctors at UCSF. Work is being shifted to emergency type work. They're staying at home, but they're being called in for emergency work. So things are changing rapidly. I talked to the CEO of Mayo the other night. Mayo is basically shut down except for emergency procedures. And but we have a healthcare system, I think, that's going to help a lot of people for the next year to reduce the death rate. And meanwhile, as Ken was indicating, we as citizens have to separate and go into social distancing. It is going to hurt the economy, but I think that's the right thing to do while we're working hard to get a vaccine. I was on the board in Novartis, and we had swine flu. There are 60 million people affected, but that swine flu vaccine basically shut it down, but it took a whole year to get it. We had 3 million doses out. So we need to not be too overly optimistic that something's going to change and everything's going to bounce back in a couple of months.
Right. I mean, we definitely want to keep viewers honest. Ken, were you going to jump in?
Yeah, I was going to make another point that we haven't talked about, I haven't seen talked about. With these kinds of viral outbreaks, often severe infections are accompanied by bacterial infections, sometimes superbacterial infections. You go back a decade to H1N1. Half of the people, nearly half of the people, the 300,000 people who lost their lives died because of bacterial pneumonia. It's important that we also continue to develop new powerful antibiotics to ensure that with respect to this particular outbreak and future outbreaks that we have those things in our arsenal.
Ken, can I ask you a question? Because you've raised a very important point. Antibiotics are key to keep people, as I understand it, people are really dying of pneumonia. That's what they contract with coronavirus, COVID-19. And so your company has been one of the few majors that stayed in the antibiotic business. And can you give us a little update on how that's going? Because I really admire you, because basically there's no money being made in this business, so you're doing it for, the human and health reasons. So maybe you could update us on that.
Yes, Bill. Last year we were fortunate to have 2 novel antibiotics approved, 2 new ones, but they have to be essentially used in those patients for whom there is resistance to the commonly used antibiotics. And the challenge is, while we continue to do this work, it's important for us to have a policy environment that rewards companies for coming up with these novel antibiotics, knowing that, in fact, many times they won't be used unless other ones fail. Just this week, we had another antibiotic company go out of business, go bankrupt. And it's not an area of medicine where there are marketplace rewards. And we want to make sure that we understand that this is an evolutionary fight between us and the bacteria, between us and the viruses. And we have to stay ahead. We have to be prepared. So we have to have an environment where people can actually put capital to work in terms of developing new antibiotics.
Hey, Bill, I got to ask you, people are coming up with all kinds of suggestions. Does a legacy manufacturer, are they able to completely reinvent their manufacturing process to create masks or build ventilators or almost on a wartime footing? How much can we look to that as a solution in the interim, where companies who have maybe had nothing to do with medical supplies start building the kinds of hardware we're going to need?
Well, we should start with the ones that have the capabilities like 3M. And yes, they can ramp up. These big companies have tremendous resources. Don't expect it overnight, but I think they will ramp up. And yes, it is like a wartime footing. I remember when Ford shifted from automobiles to tanks. Well, the medical manufacturers, the product manufacturers need to do that with ventilators to get them out there. Everyone's crying. But getting need for ventilators, they're not getting them. And so I think we need to do that while we're in this period of trying to find a solution. And that's the very best thing, and I'm confident our manufacturers will step up to that. And that's where I think a lot of the efforts from the President's task force need to be focused on working with these people to help them ramp up and get the supplies out to hospitals, because there is going to be a large influx of patients coming into these hospitals. And they need to have the supplies and equipment to protect themselves and to protect the patients.
Ken, I did want to come to you just as the leader of a large organization, given these completely unique times. How are you doing work at Merck these days? How many people are staying home? How is that being managed? How is it being implemented and executed right now?
Well, as the guest you just had from Stanford said, it's important to recognize that these essential medicines and vaccines need to get to people. People still have cancer. People still have heart conditions. So we have two objectives in this company. Number one is to keep our people safe. And what we're doing with respect to keeping our people safe is those non-essential people, we've asked them to work from home to at least the end of March. But it's important to recognize that the people in our labs, our scientists, the people in our manufacturing facilities have to continue to supply these medicines to patients who need them. And so that becomes the secondary objective, to make sure that we have the right kinds of systems in place for our manufacturing employees, for our clinical and research employees to continue to do their important work to search for solutions to coronavirus infection, as well as the other conditions that we have to deal with.
Ken, can I ask you a follow-up question?
Absolutely.
There's been a lot of free-floating criticisms of the pharmaceutical industry, but Merck seems to have taken a very different approach. I know that a lot of people, including Novartis, got out of the vaccines business, and yet you've stayed in. Again, it's a business that's not very profitable because it goes in spurts, and you might develop a vaccine, it works, and then it's gone after a year. That's what happened with H1N1 vaccine. But you've stayed in the antibiotic. What is your philosophy about that? Because this is not strictly a mercenary activity. How do you feel about that, and how does that relate to the whole mission of Merck?
Well, thank you for the question, Bill. I think at Merck, we try to follow the science, so we have to ask ourselves where there's unmet medical need. And of course, it's important for us to make a return that's fair and adequate for our shareholders. But we have found, by and large, for 130 years, if we continue to work in those areas where there's need, like, again, antibiotic research, vaccine research, that if we take the long view, that we will be rewarded in the long view, because, in fact, these infections continue to happen, and we know that we have to be prepared for them long before. For example, in the vaccine business, it took us 10 years of research and tens of thousands of people in a clinical trial for Gardasil. But Gardasil is now one of our largest products, and we're now in a position to really think about being able to eliminate cervical cancer as a cause of death.
Hey, Bill, finally, we talked about FANG for so long on this show, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google. Now I think there needs to be a FANG for test kit companies, Roche, Thermo, Hologic, LabCorp. I wonder what your take is right now on our ability to get to that day where you could test, maybe not everybody, but certainly in hotspots, most people, isolate the true positives and let the other people get back to work and get this economy fired up again.
Absolutely, but let me be very candid. We lost 4 to 5 weeks. I have great respect for the CDC, but they made some significant mistakes, not working with WHO that had testing capability and not getting the private labs involved. Finally, that got changed, and now LabCorp and Quest, two great companies, are gearing up for tests. They got sites all over the country that they can turn on, so I'm optimistic about that. Mayo Clinic has developed a test, and they're going to be up to 1,000 a day, and so that will help out. But I think we've got to get testing to everyone who needs it, and not just have the whole country be tested. But I think people, we don't know, and with the capacity of this virus to infect people who are asymptomatic before, that's why we need to get the tests out to know who has the disease so that they can be quarantined. And so I do think American industry will turn on. I'm very optimistic about that now that we've unleashed them. And I'm optimistic about Ken's industry, and I'm optimistic about the medical supplies and equipment industry and the testing industry. So we should turn to industry. I think the government's doing the right thing and looking to private industry to turn on. And there has to be a certain higher calling, as you've heard from Ken, that Merck has, that every company has to step as a profit opportunity to start price gouging, but to see this an opportunity to really save people who have this virus.
Ken, we've been focused, rightly so, on the idea of a vaccine, which, as you guys have pointed out, could still be some time away. But the antivirals that may be available in the nearer term that could conceivably reduce dramatically the fatality rate would also seem to be very important, particularly in terms of how they might affect psychology as well. What can you tell us in terms of your expectations for those kinds of antivirals that may be being worked on that could prove effective in making sure the virus is not as fatal?
Yes. So, as I said earlier, we're encouraged that some of our research-based industry colleagues are bringing some of those antiviral opportunities into early-stage trials. As I said, companies like Merck and other companies are testing their existing antiviral drugs and candidates to see if they have activity against this novel coronavirus. So I think the time frame in which that could happen, either single drugs or combination drugs, is a much shorter time. And the point of this is not to discourage people, because I think this industry will do everything in its power to come forward with those kind of antiretroviral therapies, but also to make sure that we're realistic and we're reminding people that right now we have the power as citizens to stop the spread, or at least to slow the spread of this virus. And that's what we can do in the next week, month, etc., to ensure that we actually don't have the kind of situation that we see in Italy.
Something you can literally do starting today if you haven't already. Ken, please come back soon. We appreciate it so much. And Bill George, as always, we'll talk to you later.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
All right. Be safe.
With stocks sinking, one place getting a lot more attention is the corporate credit market. Our Dom Chu is taking a look at that area for us. Dom, good morning.
Good morning, Mike. So one of the places we are seeing those stresses play out a little bit more, even so today with the market going the way it is on the corporate credit side of things. And we have seen a pretty big divergence that's maybe starting to shift a little bit towards a wholesale sell-off of the market, but there are certain points that certain investors are paying attention to. They're looking at bond insurance, something called credit default swaps, and we've seen some of the hardest hit or center point industries within the coronavirus whole kind of market dynamic play out there in those bond insurance markets. Now, these are credit default swaps on places like in travel and tourism, say with the cruise line operators. Carnival Cruise Line, it now costs about $650,000 a year to insure $10 million worth of corporate debt from Carnival. Also, places like in the oil and gas industry. Hess is a fairly decent-sized, large-sized producer, integrated oil company. Some of those particular bond insurance pieces are now charging about $550, over $500,000 a year to insure $10 million worth of bonds against default. On the other side, consumer staples companies like Clorox, they've actually seen their rates fall, meaning it costs less to insure against a possible default on a company like Clorox than it did just about 2 or 3 months ago. Now it's pretty much below $50,000 a year to insure $10 million worth of debt. I spoke before a little bit about the kind of divergence that we had been seeing over the course of the past several months now in certain parts of the bond market. If you are a highly rated bond issuer or company, Jim Cramer mentions Johnson & Johnson, a lot of companies like that. Well, their costs have generally, over the near to medium term, been coming down in terms of their interest rates. Meanwhile, some of the more highly risky issuers, those that are rated CCC, those particular types of bonds are now yielding a lot more. Investors are claiming, and they want a lot more yield for those. If we do see that dynamic start to kind of shift a little bit, that could be a key place to watch for stresses in the market. And guys, I would just note here that as the volatility plays out in the stock market, we have not yet really seen a lot of the stuff that would happen in very, very stressed out credit markets. So it's certainly a flashpoint, guys, a focal point to watch.
Yeah, for sure. And obviously a lot of attention on the investment grade credits that might be subject to downgrade and all the other kind of chain reactions that sometimes kick in.
Absolutely.
All right, Dom, thanks very much. We'll talk to you soon. A massive multi-phased fiscal stimulus plan now awaiting a congressional vote. Speaking at a news conference yesterday, Treasury Secretary Mnuchin emphasized the need to send cash to American families struggling during this crisis. This is an argument our next guest made on March 5th in a Wall Street Journal op-ed saying Congress should send you $1,000 and another $500 for each of your children as soon as possible. The author of that op-ed, Jason Furman, former Council of Economic Advisors chair, is with us right now. Jason, great to have you here. So you've, as we said, been kind of early and often advocating this type of policy. What is your characterization of the effort right now in terms of the magnitude, the speed, and whether it'll be sufficient to buffer this economy?
Yeah, I can say a week ago I was very nervous about the state of the economy. Now, even though we've taken even more steps to shut the economy down, I'm less nervous. I'm less nervous because of the vigor of the health response and because economic policymakers are really pulling out the stops and using, all the tools they have in their arsenal, and they're still soon going to start inventing new tools. And, I'm happy to see that.
And so, obviously, direct cash to households, however quickly it might get there, is a cushion, and obviously can help people cover bills. What about, the rest of the scope of what we're facing right here in terms of business shutdown? How would you even set policy when there's such an indefinite nature to this virtual shutdown of parts of the economy?
Yeah, we're operating under a situation of extreme uncertainty right now. And that's why I thought some of the tools that we know how to do, that we've done before, we should deploy them right away. And that's cash for people. But that's only part of the response. Part of what we need to do is make sure that a lot of businesses don't go bankrupt, a lot of workers don't get laid off. And that's much, much more complicated. There's a lot of creativity going into that. Ideas of loan facilities. Andrew Ross Sorkin had a nice column on that. Some economists are talking about grants. There's a lot of affected industries, a lot of small businesses. I'm not sure right now which of those ideas are best, but we need to figure that part out really quick.
And then on the kind of larger scale side, in terms of whole industries that have had this sudden stop affect them. Now, we've been reporting about Boeing and the rest of the aerospace industry looking for something. Does the principle of get cash where it belongs quickly and worry about the details later also apply here? Because there already has been a debate that has raged against what stipulations there might be placed on that, whether in fact, to dilute shareholders or penalize companies for having bought back stock. I mean, how do we navigate all those issues?
Yeah, I think large companies are different. With individuals, we can't sit down and figure out an individualized plan with each one of 300 million Americans. with some of our largest industries, is more of an ability to do that. So the immediate problem is liquidity. Make sure they have liquidity. And then there are mechanisms that have been used, GM, Chrysler, others in the past, that ensure some socializing of the losses, not all the taxpayers, but also equity and potentially debt holders as well.
Yeah. And then just quickly, in terms of the cash to households, there have been some of these proposals about a provision to keep that going based on certain economic conditions or labor market conditions. Where do you come down on that?
Absolutely critical. One of the lessons of last time was that a bunch of the support ended sooner than it should. I would not leave it to Congress next year to figure out if it's still needed. They can get tired of things after the most acute phase passes. And so put in triggers now. If the employment rate is too low next year, the checks go out again. At the same time, aid to states, other aid to individuals, and continue to work on the business side. This needs to be comprehensive. This is one important part of it, though.
All right, Jason Furman, thanks very much. We'll talk to you again as this all moves along.
Thanks for having me.
Meantime, Dow down 1,200, not too far from session lows, which was down 1,339. Virus fears in New York driving those who can afford it to look for vacations. Our Robert Frank is watching that this morning. Hey, Robert.
Good morning, Carl. Well, rental prices in the Hamptons, the Hudson Valley, and other nearby getaways more than tripling as New Yorkers flee the city. Now, in the Hamptons, one oceanfront property just rented for $100,000. That's just for the month of April, a price that would be high even for August. March and April are usually the off-season, of course, in the Hamptons, but brokers say homes that would rent for $5,000 a month now going for $25,000 a month. Some renters asking to start their scheduled summer rentals now, others taking homes for an entire year just to know that they will have a place. Now, in the Hudson Valley, there is a sudden shortage of rental homes since most of the homes up there on Airbnb and VRBO are owned by city residents who want them for their own families right now. One broker is saying a house that rents for $4,000 a month in the off-season just rented for $18,000 for April. Brokers are calling homeowners throughout the Hudson Valley looking for houses to rent. Some locals opting to give up their houses and stay with relatives given the generous offers. This log home in Columbia County asking now $600 a night, showing that with every crisis, guys, comes an opportunity. Back over to you.
All right. Robert, thank you very much for that. Good Wednesday morning, everybody. I'm Carl Quintanilla here at Post 9 of the New York Stock Exchange. Morgan Brennan is with us from CNBC headquarters. John Ford helms our coverage from the floor of the NYSE. Obviously, we lost all of yesterday's gains. Dow's down 1,200 points. We'll begin with today's market action. Shares of Boeing taking the Dow down as stocks sell off across all the major averages. Oakmark Select Funds portfolio manager Win Murray joins us today. Win, we know that Oakmark is always hunting for value, and so the question today is how much value is being created in your eyes?
Well, you're right. We are bottom-up value investors. We're trying to think about companies, what they're going to be worth over the lifetime of their existence. We think that the current stock price declines are well in excess of the actual economic loss that's likely to be experienced by these companies looking out over the next 5 to 10 years.
All right. Why do you say that? What leads you to that point of view?
Well, if you think about how much cash flow these companies produce in a given year, it's maybe 5-6% of their market cap. And if you think about if it was your private business, if you owned it as a family and you lost a year's worth of cash flow, you'd say, okay, the value of this business is down 5 or 6%. If you think that that's somewhat permanently impaired, you can say, okay, the value may be down 10 or 15%. But assuming that your business can survive until the next upturn, and we think this will be a fairly sharp but relatively brief downturn, then you'd say, okay, well, my business is not worth half of what it was trading at 3 months ago. But that's where these stock prices are currently, what they're currently pricing in.
Yeah, certainly we'll have to see how all of this plays out over the medium to long term. When in the meantime, though, I mean, we have equities selling off. We have treasuries selling off with yields ticking higher. We've got gold selling off right now. It would seem that at least right now, there's sort of like nowhere to hide for investors. What do you make of these dynamics taking place in the market?
It makes a lot of sense personally if if you're concerned about your health, to take precautions for your family to avoid risk. In financial markets, you should not be trying to avoid risk at times when prices are incredibly distressed. If you look back to the financial crisis, we thought the financial system was going away. If you look back to 9/11, you thought society was permanently changing. You have these moments of stress where investors, because of uncertainty, say now's time to protect our portfolio, when in reality, the prices that are being offered are such that you should be more of a risk seeker at this point in time. So, yes, to your question, where do you hide today relative to next week's stock price? That's very difficult to guess, and we're not going to pretend that we know what to do. But we can say that if you look out, these are very, very attractive entry points into some amazing companies.
When I understand the logic that this is an attractive entry point, what I question, what I want to hear more from you about, is this idea of it being a relatively brief dip. We hear other people talk about it as a V-shaped recovery. I see the potential for the impacts of this to be longer lasting, particularly for those at the bottom half of the economy. So I wonder from you, what are the necessary conditions for this recovery that we hope to see to be more V-shaped? What kinds of fiscal stimulus do you think will be necessary?
Well, the necessary conditions for recovery, first of all, is that the presumption that within the next 12 to 18 months that we will have a vaccine or that we will have good medical treatments in place so that people are not petrified and holed up in their houses. I think that everyone assumes that that'll be the case. And so you have to get your mind to a point where you're not concerned about walking outside your front door. We think that travel will recover. It's a lovely picture of me that you have on the TV, but I think that it's, better dressed than I currently am. But I think that it's a much, it's very likely that people are going to be traveling for business and leisure again. So what you need between now and then is when the unemployment rate spikes to 20 or 25% and a number of people have trouble paying rent, this is the kind of exogenous event. This isn't a financial crisis, it's a health crisis where you would want the government to step in, like in the case of an asteroid or something like that. You'd want the government to step in and provide assistance for people who had no way of forecasting or planning that this was going to impact them.
But you would acknowledge that the way people, even with the vaccine, even with confidence that you could leave your home and go back to work and go about your business, that the way we shop, the way we fly, the way we eat out, the way we travel will be permanently changed. Do you disagree?
I think that anyone who lives through this, just like anyone who lived through the financial crisis, just like anyone who lived through September 11th, will have in the back of their mind the experiences that they went through. But I think, as in all of those cases, that if you go out 3, 4, 5 years, you would say, if you moved somebody forward in time 10 years from before the event to after the event, you would say, things are relatively settled out from a society perspective. Now, technology advances and causes some things to change, food delivery, teleconferencing. That was happening in any case. But I think that right now in the moment, we're sort of overstating the permanence of how this will feel.
Wayne, I've got a two-part question for you here before we wrap this up. And the first is, I'm looking at Oakmark Select Fund Holdings, the equity sector breakdowns, 28% financials. Given everything we're seeing play out with interest rates, with the discussion around the banks and other financial entities right now, will you continue to stick with that weighting? And secondly, I guess in part depending on that, are there other specific names or specific sectors that you think look particularly attractive right now at these levels?
Sure. We think financials look exceptionally attractive. We think that their balance sheets have never been less risky. We think the stress tests that were required by the government to basically show that they could be profitable through something like we saw in 08 and 09 are quite pertinent today and are not going to be breached by any stretch. These are excellent franchises. They're going to exist in a societally necessary form for as long as we can see, and they're at great prices right now. the consumer discretionary sector right now is getting killed. Everything related to travel, things related to auto. Generally speaking, if you have companies in that space like Lear, which makes automotive seating for most of the world, like Hilton, one of the best hotel chains in the world, selling at prices that are half of what they were even 3 months ago, we think that they look very attractive.
When a lot of our viewers hope you're right. Just very tough to know at this point. We really appreciate you coming on and helping us understand your playbook anyway. Win Murray.
Thank you, guys.
Just note that the Dow is back down more than 1,000 points, 1264 right now, trading back under 20,000. Similar moves close to session lows for the S&P as well, down 140 points right now. Meantime, Marriott furloughing thousands of employees as occupancy levels plunge due to the virus. Seema Modi has that story from HQ for us. Seema.
Morgan, coronavirus and the subsequent plunge in hotel bookings has forced Marriott, the largest hotel operator, to furlough tens of thousands of employees as it looks to close a number of hotels. Hilton already suspending operations at 2 managed properties, the Capitol Hilton in Washington, D.C. and the New York Hilton in Midtown. Both are not accepting reservations and more closures are in the cards. Yesterday, the CEOs of Hilton, Marriott, Best Western, among others, met with President Trump, urging him to assist in protecting millions of hotel workers who face furloughs and layoffs. Leaders requesting a relief package of around $150 billion in financial aid. AHLA, the trade body that represents the hospitality sector, says $1.4 billion in revenue is lost every week due to the virus, impacting 4.6 million jobs across the U.S. The hotel executives I speak to say the first goal here is to protect their workers. The second will be to address liquidity concerns. Last week, Hilton did tap its $1.75 billion credit line to ease the financial blow of the virus. And SunTrust says there are discussions about Hyatt and possibly Marriott likely trying to do the same. We're putting a quick look at the shares of Hilton, but also want to draw your attention to Marriott. It's down nearly 30% right now, guys, on pace for a record percentage drop as investors try to price in the effect of lower occupancies for the foreseeable future. Morgan, for now, back to you.
Yeah, some very dramatic moves, Seema. Thank you, Seema Modi at HQ. I'll just note Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin will join our Jim Cramer in just a few moments. That interview will be taking place at 11:15 a.m. Eastern, so stay tuned for that. In the meantime, we're going to continue to stick with this hospitality theme, and we're going to bring in our next guest, who owns several hotels, including the Ritz-Carlton and the Marriott in Washington, D.C. Monty Bennett, Ashford Hospitality Trust Chairman, joins us now on the CNBC Newsline. Monty, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
So we're hearing about plunging hotel occupancy rates. You've got travel grinding to a halt. You have people hunkering down due to the coronavirus and the concerns there. How is that playing out for your different properties in different parts of the country right now?
We have about 130 properties across the country of all different segment types, from mid-scale type properties like Hampton Inns up to Ritz-Carlton and very high-end properties. And what I think people are just starting to understand is not only is this affecting the hotel industry, but it is far, far worse than the financial crisis or 9/11. And I never thought that I'd say something like that, or that a crisis would come close to those two.
Why is that the case?
In those other situations, occupancies took hits. In the hotel business, if your revenues are up 10%, you do very well. If your revenues are down 10%, then you can really get creamed. And in those situations, occupancies dropped and revenues dropped 10%, 20%. Well, now there's no business. They're dropping down to nothing. We have hotels that are closing. Some hotels are running in the single digits. The loss of revenues is 100%. So the impact of just no travel and no business in these hotels is just absolutely devastating.
Yeah, and when I hear numbers like that, I would imagine it has major ripple effects and means some very painful decisions have to be made. I'm looking at these notes. It says you've reduced the workforce at your hotels by about 95%. What has that reduction entailed? Are you furloughing workers? Are you actually laying people off?
We're doing a lot of everything, and it's heartbreaking. We have about 7,000 associates across the country, and we've laid off, we've terminated many, we've furloughed many, we've just For some of the hourlies, we've just not extending them hours for them to work. And people that have worked for me for 30 years, and we just can't afford to pay them. There's just no revenues coming in. Hotels are big operations with lots of revenues and lots of payroll. And when that revenue doesn't come in, we can't afford to pay anything. And I'm just getting notes from employees that have worked for me for years and years, and it's just devastating what's happening to them.
Monty, about those workers and the notes that you're getting, I think government right now is trying to figure out the right kind of fiscal policy response to help workers exactly like those. From what you've been able to gather so far, your experience working with this workforce over decades, what's the type of assistance you think is going to be most effective for them right now? I don't imagine it's giving you the money necessarily because you're having to furlough people, and as you said, even a 10% reduction would be difficult for you. The current conditions are really, really rough. Should the government be mailing checks to these workers specifically? Are there other types of assistance you think might be even more effective?
Our number one priority is our associates.
All right, I think we might have just lost Monty Bennett's connection there, Ashford Hospitality Chairman and founder. If we can get him back up on the line in the next few moments, we will. In the meantime, just getting a check on the markets here. The Dow continuing to slide lower, down 1,349 points right now, 19,893 is your level there. Similar moves lower for the S&P as well, down 148 points. Nearly 6%, 5.8%, and the NASDAQ holding up relative to those other averages, down just 4.9%. Carl?
Yeah, Morgan, and I think what we were just getting into with Monty Bennett is one of the things that I hope to hear more about from the Treasury Secretary. It's exactly what types of fiscal stimulus, what types of help is the administration considering? We heard from Mitch McConnell that the Senate is not going to go into recess. They're going to stay in Washington until they've done quite a bit more in terms of action around helping with this coronavirus situation. How do you get help to those workers who are so reliant on the service economy? We heard some numbers earlier on CNBC about the number of layoffs, in the mid 3,000 range. We know that can't be at all representative of the hardship that so many blue-collar workers, service industry workers are facing. Restaurants, hospitality in New York shut down. It is rough, Carl.
Indeed, John. I want to get back to headquarters this morning. Our Jim Cramer is joined by the Treasury Secretary. Hey, Jim.
Oh, so great to see you, Carl. Mr. Secretary, are you with us?
I am indeed. Good to be with you.
Oh, thank you, Secretary Mnuchin. Well, let's get right to it. I know you and I have talked many times. The working people, 100 million people at jeopardy, trying to figure out how to put meals on the table, clothe, house. What is your message to them?
Well, the message is the president is taking all his actions and working very closely with the Senate and the House to make sure that we help hardworking Americans, that we help small businesses, and that we help industries that are particularly impacted by this. And people are doing what the president has said, which is we are closing down parts of the economy to make sure we destroy this disease, and we will. That we will get through this. Americans should know we have the best medical professionals, we have the best medical system, and we will conquer this disease. But in an effort to stop the spread, the president has asked certain businesses not to, restaurants, bars, and things like that, at no fault of their own. We're telling people not to go to those businesses, and we're going to deliver assistance. I think, Jim, yesterday at the president's direction, I announced what is really a $1.3 trillion program. $300 billion of it is deferred tax payments. We had previously announced that at the president's direction. We increased that from $200 billion to $300 billion. We're about to put out an IRS press release. Again, I want to emphasize to taxpayers, we're not moving the April 15th date. What we're moving is the date you need to pay the money. So for lots of people, they will get refunds. For those of you who want to file, please do so. For those of you who don't, you can request the normal extension. That's $300 billion of liquidity. And we're going to Congress. I've been in discussions with the Senate and the House for another $1 trillion. And that's a combination of programs. It's small business interruption loans that we want to get out right away. It's economic impact payments to the American public. And let me say, when I said checks in the mail, that was a metaphor. The IRS has a lot of information for taxpayers for direct deposits, and where we don't, we're working with electronic payment providers. So that is money we can get to hardworking Americans right away. And the last component will be an injection into the exchange stabilization fund so we can make critical loans to the airlines industries, the hotel industries, the travel industries, and other businesses that will have great cash flow coming out of this, but need loans now.
Well, Mr. Secretary, you used a number, it's been quoted, maybe 20% people laid off. Well, that's FDR. That's the Great Depression, not the Great Recession. When you say that, of course, it trembles and right through so many hardworking Americans. Is there a way to cut that down? I mean, we know we're going to beat this thing. You know we're going to beat this, and we don't want to get a situation where those people are off and can't get those jobs back.
Jim, I want to be very clear because I've seen that number in the press, okay? And I didn't in any way say I think we're going to have that. And let me be clear. If we follow the president's plan, we will not have it. What I said was just a mathematical statement, which is 40% of the people that are employed in the private workforce are employed by companies 500 people and less. It was just a mathematical statement to say, if half these people were to lose their jobs, this is what it would be. But we're not going to let that happen. Okay. The president has said, we're going to make sure that companies have money so that they continue to pay those employees. It's no fault of theirs. And by the way, this U.S. economy is going to come roaring back once we conquer this disease. This isn't like the financial crisis. There will be an end in sight.
Well, Mr. Secretary, would you ever think about something? I know as you've been saying, you can't think big enough. Doing something like making sure that the American people actually do well here by investing, say, Social Security money, maybe a new entity entirely, like what maybe Secretary Morgenthau would have created. I know you're a student of history of the Treasury Department. A new entity that made it so that we bought stakes. The American people buy a stake in Boeing. Suddenly, Boeing becomes no issue, off the table, and the American people benefit. Will we ever be that creative? I know that would require Congress, just like it would require Congress to be able, for the Fed to be able to buy corporates. And I know you know trading better than anyone we've ever had in your position. Is it possible to be that creative, that big thing? Because it really would take a lot of pressure off the markets.
I think the president's been very clear. We're going to do whatever we need to take. And we have certain actions. We're using them. Actions we don't have. We're working with Congress. I have a lot of confidence there's going to be bipartisan support. The Senate already has 3 task forces working on different things. So I have a lot of confidence that, we have a great economy. We're doing certain things. We'll bounce back. And yesterday, the Fed took very significant actions. I did approve them. Fed chair needed our approval. And yesterday, this announcement was very important. $1 trillion of support for the A1P1 commercial paper market. So, we saw issues in those markets. The Fed reacted quickly. We reacted quickly. And we're going to continue to make sure we react quickly.
When you take a breather, right? I know you haven't had one because we worked all weekend. Do you think about the great secretaries of Treasury who really fought huge? I mean, think about a Morgenthau with FDR who recognized that we have to take fear itself, and also we have to clothe, we have to house. Are you thinking of these models? Because I do think, Mr. Secretary, this is a historic time, and we would love to know if you and the president are thinking, you know what, trillion, it doesn't matter. It's whatever it takes to make so 100 million working people feel like I have nothing to fear.
Absolutely. The president has said, let's think big. Congress understands what we need to do. Again, we are going to protect American workers because we're doing these things because of this virus. And again, there is an end in sight, Jim. And, the medical professionals are doing a great job. We're getting more and more testing out. But we're going to provide whatever economic aid we need to this economy.
Well, it does. Look, the stock market we know is smaller than the bond market. I know we all feel good if there's no freeze up, if the Federal Reserve can do what gets congressional approval to be able to buy, and Treasury Secretary to be able to buy the corporates. But one thing I think that we see, because we watch our screens, and you know, we worked in this business for years, we see the bank stocks go down every minute. We see the transports go down every minute. We see Boeing, which we know is faced with a liquidity problem and says they need $60 billion for just the entire supply line, not just Boeing. What do we say to the people who are just saying, I give up, I'm selling Boeing?
Rite Aid does and what Rite Aid has, and what perhaps might change as a result of the kinds of public health challenges that you're going to be trying to help customers face in the coming months and years?
Well, I would have to say that I certainly didn't anticipate this when I joined the company. I certainly did know this was a turnaround and that we had significant issues around our debt and we had to really revitalize our brand. But what I did know and what I was hoping would be the case was that we would be able to grow our company by focusing on being a pharmacy and pharmacy services business. And this is ironic because our strategy is really centered around pharmacy first and leveraging the pharmacist as the front line of defense in the healthcare business, engaging consumers in ways that no one else can. And who would have known that this would be on such display so soon? And I think that the irony of this is that if there was ever a need or an opportunity for pharmacists to show that they can be the last mile extender in the healthcare system in a situation such as this, it is the COVID-19 epidemic. The pharmacists are really emergency responders in this situation.
Yeah.
And I'm so fortunate to have 6,400 of what I believe are the best, most dedicated, and most tenured pharmacists in America working with us at Rite Aid.
Yeah, Hayward, this is Morgan. It's such a key point that you make, and I feel like in times of crisis, and certainly in this time of pandemic, it is the people and people with specialized skills that end up being the most valuable asset at a time like this, whether it is pharmacists or technicians or even the cleaning crews that you're bringing in regularly to stores right now. Do you feel like you have enough people?
I am so proud of our associates. We have not had any additional call-out volume over and above the normal. Our associates are all hands on deck, and you're right, it's not just the pharmacists, it's the front-end staff, it's the techs. They have delivered and are delivering. It's the distribution center associates as well are delivering over-the-top service now to our customers. You know, it's not easy. They're just so committed, and I'm so proud of them. And, you know, the reality is the great thing about this for Rite Aid is that in the near term, we can do good by doing good. And I think that's really what's fortunate for us, and it's our opportunity for our associates to live the mission and the vision that we put forth on Analyst Day and even before.
Hayward, you talked about potentially being a place where people can obtain tests. How quickly do you think that will happen and get to someplace like a Rite Aid at the pharmacy counter to be able to obtain a COVID test?
You know, it's so hard to know right now. We are, by the way, working daily with the White House Committee and Task Force. It's so fluid right now. One thing I would say is that we do flu testing and strep testing in some states today where they allow us to do that, and obviously we follow the state regs. But we do testing today, and we would certainly want to be providing these tests when they become commercially available. But we don't know exactly what's going to happen at this point. It's so fluid.
Customers know about either the restocking process at Rite Aid, how much they should think about getting when they go into a store versus perhaps not hoarding, the types of things that are in short supply, the types of things perhaps that they should be getting that they're not picking up. Is there any advice along those lines that you can give us?
Well, first, I think, and foremost, you know, it's really important that people be able to obtain and get on a regular basis their medication. That's priority one. We're partnering with PBMs and providers to ensure people that can get a 90-day refill do. We just announced that we're offering home delivery out of all 2,400 stores, and we're waiving the fees. For certain drugs. Certain drugs can't be delivered to home, but those that can, we're waiving any delivery. We do have drive-thrus in 50 of our stores. We're really encouraging that. We have both the in-store supplies and the RiteAid.com supplies. Clearly, essentials are the priority, so sanitizing, cleaning. We don't have any real, I wouldn't say we're getting wiped out of toilet paper and paper towel, but there's not really a problem getting those supplies restocked. It's just a matter of how fast you get them back on the shelves. We are placing and asking customers to place limits on certain essential items because we do want to make sure that everyone has an opportunity, if possible, to get some level of supplies. So that is one thing that we have been asking customers to support us in.
Hayward, you are an essential store in this situation. How are you handling staffing? How are you handling workers, some of whom are also going to have issues with childcare or if they themselves become sick?
Absolutely. We are the most dense pharmacy today in the nation's top 4 hotspots. So we have the number 1 share in the number 1 or number 2 share of scripts in the top 4 hotspots: California, Washington, New York, and Pennsylvania, where we're headquartered. And so we, of anyone, are experiencing the issues with childcare and associates in terms of being able to come to work, and potentially call out. And as I said earlier, these committed associates, they've been helping each other out in terms of childcare. They've been covering each other's shifts. We have not had any unusual level of call out. So we have been able to continue our staffing levels. We have not yet, and don't know if we will change store hours. We have daily crews coming into those locations. So I'm so proud and amazed that we're still able to handle all of this, and I think the test has really been for us in those areas. So far, so good.
It is amazing what you are able to do, given all the personal challenges. I mean, you're dealing with this as human beings, just like we all are. I am curious, Hayward, if you've been able to monitor and judge Italy's experience from maybe some of your peers in terms of managing supply and demand under broad shelters in place.
Yes, I mean, we are the broad shelters in place in Northern California, where my daughter happens to live, and in now Pennsylvania. I just do want to reinforce that we are paying people. We are paying people who are quarantined. We're paying people who get sick. You know, my moral obligation is to take care of our people. This is nothing that they were able to control. So we're being very generous, and you know, the lessons from Italy, I think, is that we encourage everyone to follow the CDC guidelines. We have moved all of our corporate associates throughout our company to work at home on Monday evening, and we are still, you know, moving call center associates where required to home. So I think that we feel optimistic that if we can all work together in our communities to follow the CDC guidelines and ensure our own safety, that I can continue to have a team of associates that can continue to keep these stores open as we are essential.
Hayward Donegan, thank you from Rite Aid. Such an important interview to hear from you. Our thanks to Bertha Coombs for bringing it to us. Let's get over to Rick Santelli in Chicago and check in with Rick Dowsdown 1365. Rick?
Yes, thanks, Carl. I'd like to welcome Mellon's chief economist, Vincent Reinhart. Vincent, thank you for joining me today. Let's get right into it. I want to talk 3 issues. I'm going to bring them up, and I want you to give me your viewpoint. Dollar funding, even the Swiss were auctioning dollars. Everybody needs dollars, and it is soaring. Second issue, credit spreads in Europe are widening against spoons, whether you look at the French 10-year or the Italian 10-year, and this is something to pay attention to. And the third issue, of course, is that we want to help people. I get that. But moving to my market guy hat, you said in your note, market monetary theory, we're watching it. Cut taxes, don't even think about anything with regard to deficits. We want to help people, but we do need to remember, in the last crisis, sometimes the hurry to write checks isn't the best way to proceed. Weigh in on all 3, Vincent.
Okay, so the first 2 really are pretty related, which is when you are the safe haven, capital goes to you. In the world is at large. The U.S. is the safe haven asset, even though we are now getting the real brunt of the coronavirus infection, or we're seeing our currency appreciate because it's still the place to go. Germany is seeing the same thing, that within the European continent, Germany has many more resources to address problems. By the way, that leads to your third point, which is if you squander those resources, you may no longer wind up being the safe haven. That's the longer-term risk associated with all this. Look, we got to help people. We have to, make as many possible efforts. But, we're not a command and control economy like China. We just can't shut things down. And we really do have to consider alternative means of dealing with this problem.
I have so many friends that are still in the commission-driven business, in all financing and trading businesses. And I had one, and he's small. He told me, listen, I have a couple $100,000 a month in my employment nut that I have to pay out my employees. He said, and I'm small, and there's a zillion of us all over. He said the government isn't going to be able to take on all of this. Having full closures and watching these businesses go, I'm not saying I have the answer, but this is a really difficult issue.
It's extremely hard, Rick. 46% of American workers are at firms under 300 employees. That probably means they don't have resources, even if on the high end of that scale. And a good chunk of those people are actually single-person entrepreneurs. We're all proud of ourselves talking about the rise of the gig economy. Well, what happens to those gig workers when people aren't going into Ubers and Lyfts and aren't going to restaurants? That's a real hardship. And what you're going to see is not just employment go down. You're going to see business formations disappear, and you're going to see lots of bankruptcies. The longer we do this, the bigger the toll.
Now, listen, we're just about out of time, Vincent, and I want to pick your brain. My final question to you is this. When it comes to the dollar, and the Fed and everything they've done, it doesn't seem to have made a difference. So I guess the point is, trying to do everything to make a difference now, we have no idea if the things we're implementing today will actually work better once this kind of nervous phase disappears a little bit. Your final thought.
So if it is a nervous phase and it disappears, then the Fed is going to be mispositioned. They have put in place policies that eat accommodation that's going to be hard to unwind, particularly in an election year. So that's what happens when you have L-shaped policy meeting a V-shaped economy.
And just to make sure everybody understands, I'm not saying the nervous phase is because we're not looking at this disease in an appropriate fashion. I'm talking about maybe the market's trying to overcompensate because they don't know how to price in such an event. Vincent, we're out of time. I thank you for joining me today. We're going to be having you back a lot during this crisis period. Thank you again. Morgan, back to you.
Rick Santelli, thank you.
I will take it, Rick.
Oh, there you go. Back over to the stock exchange.
We are, moments away from seeing the president, we expect, and that virus task force briefing at the White House. Our Eamon Javers, also in the Washington area. Eamon, do you know what we should expect today? We just heard from the Treasury Secretary, who joined the briefing yesterday, is clearly working on Capitol Hill, trying to get the president and the White House's view and expectations of legislation communicated there and things moving along quickly. Today, I suppose we don't expect to see him at this briefing, but we do expect to hear about any new parameters for how the government is dealing with this.
Absolutely, and these briefings have been surprising us in terms of the velocity of the news cycle here, John. But one thing that we did just learn, NBC News is reporting from the Governor Cuomo in New York, that the United States Navy is moving a hospital ship to New York City. That hospital ship is the USS Comfort. I believe that has about 1,000 beds on it, so that will supplement some of the hospital capacity in New York City. My understanding is that there are 2 hospital ships in the U.S. Navy. One is usually in San Diego, Diego on the West Coast. One is usually in Norfolk on the East Coast. We could expect to see some deployments on the West Coast as well if they're moving that hospital ship out on the East Coast right now. We might hear from the president on that one. And then the question is, I think that needs to be answered here is, how many rounds of payments does the federal government anticipate making here for workers? You're talking about a round of $1,000 or $2,000 checks, at least to start with. Then the question is, what do you do after the 2-week period? Do you have to do this again and again and again, depending on how long the financial impact from this virus lasts? As we're all sitting here in our home offices, or a lot of us anyway, John, maybe not you, you do get a sense of an entire nation and an entire economy hunkered down right now, spending turning off like a spigot, and everybody's spending is somebody else's revenue throughout the entire economy. So how much spending does the U.S. government think it's going to have to do now in order to get those checks to the individual Americans who've been impacted? That's one of the big questions I think we're going to need to get an answer to in this briefing.
Maybe the key question, Eamon. Mnuchin did just talk to Cramer a few moments ago, and I'll quote him here: "We are closing down parts of the economy to make sure we destroy this disease, and we will." AP's running a headline right now: Treasury proposal, Eamon, deliver $500 billion in checks to millions of Americans. First round coming April 6th. But the question will be, if we're truly in for 15 days, as the president said 2 days ago, 15 days to stem the spread, what happens after April 6th? Do we need to go another round or not? They're also talking, some headlines flashing here on small business loans. For example, small businesses could borrow up to 6 weeks of payroll costs, capped at $80,000 annualized. This is according to Reuters, which got a look at the document. So maybe on the margin, some of the details are starting to fill in.
Yeah, we're getting a little bit more here from NBC News, which I can relay to you, Carl, from some of the documents. The Treasury Department document here obtained by NBC News is the source of this. They're laying out a 3-stage stimulus proposal here. One is $50 billion for the airline industry. Another one is $150 billion for what they're calling other distressed sectors. No indication of what sectors those are necessarily. 2 rounds of direct payments to taxpayers, as you were talking about, each for $250 billion. One on April 6th, one on May 18th. There's a tiered payment amount based on income level, and interestingly, for those of us with a lot of children, family size is going to impact this. Small business interruption loan program of about $300 billion. So those are some of the specifics that we're learning here right now, Carl, in real time. Also, I want to make a broader point, and we've been talking about this throughout the day. Everything that the United States government does right now is going to echo through American politics for a decade or more. We are still living with the legacy of the 2008 financial crisis and the political fallout from that. And I would point directly from that financial crisis to the rise of Occupy Wall Street, to the rise of the Tea Party, to a millennial generation that is concerned about capitalism as an operating system for the economy, and is socialism in numbers that we have not seen before. A president of the United States who is very inwardly focused on the United States and has an America First approach to the world. I think all of those things, to one degree or another, are legacies of the last round of bailouts and government intervention in the economy, and the anger that those things engendered throughout the political system. And I think Americans will accept huge, dramatic changes, huge interventions, but they have to be perceived ultimately as fundamentally fair. And I think that's going to be the thing that policymakers need to consider as they walk through all of this, guys.
Yeah, and of course, we're having this conversation in a week where we've seen 3 more primaries play out in 3 more states. Report right now from Axios, we have not confirmed this, that Senator Bernie Sanders is suspending his presidential campaign right now, Eamon. How does it speak to the fact that we do continue to have this presidential election year and campaigns playing out even in the midst of coronavirus and lockdowns in so many states?
Sure. Well, that was sort of mathematically inevitable and politically inevitable in the wake of the trouncing that Bernie Sanders took yesterday. I mean, the Florida defeat was pretty resounding for Sanders. And then the question is, does the Democratic Party consolidate here behind Joe Biden? They've been split, they've been divided. There's been some real animosity between the parties. And what Sanders can do now for his party is to bring his people into the fold for Biden. We'll see whether that happens or not because of some of those bruised feelings. But look, in terms of the coronavirus, I mean, you've got the government on the one hand saying we can't have gatherings of more than 10 people at any given time, but also, we held elections during the Civil War and during World War II, right? We don't stop elections in this country.
Yeah, amen. Certainly a lot of headlines crossing right now. Thank you for breaking down the latest. I'm really curious to see what happens with this Navy ship, especially given the fact that the Pentagon has also said it's going to free up 5 million respirator masks, 2,000 ventilators for coronavirus efforts in the last 24 hours. And certainly there's been that debate about whether and how the role of the Department of Defense could expand as efforts ramp up with the federal government. In the meantime, the spread of the coronavirus taking its toll on restaurants and small businesses as multiple states close their doors amid the outbreak. Our next guest just met with the president about keeping drive-through and takeout options open for the industry. International Franchise Association CEO Robert Crisanti joins us now on the phone. Robert, thanks for being with us. Given the fact that you were present for this meeting with the president yesterday, what was your message and what did that conversation entail?
I can just say that thank you so much for having me on, Morgan, and for your entire team. I think our message was simple. The majority of franchise owners are small business owners, hundreds of thousands of whom are seeking revenue, for their businesses. We're seeing it shrink at an unprecedented rate, and we need relief now as quickly as possible. Small businesses, both in the restaurant industry and in other sectors like home improvement and gyms and hair salons, have no customers walking through the door and a lot of fixed costs in place, and therefore there is no cash flow. You saw Kramer talk about this earlier. This is why IFA, along with our members, need the federal government to step in and increase liquidity to those small businesses fast. And I have been, this has been, I just can't say how, if Americans could see how this administration and the leadership, both Nancy Pelosi and Senator Schumer's staffs are reacting and listening to the voices that are coming in from these small business folks, you would be proud of the functioning of this country. It's not always what we hear reported in the press, but the Secretary Mnuchin and I were texting and on the phone, at close to midnight on Saturday night, and we have been in constant and consistent touch, and they are able to turn around things faster than I've ever seen the federal government turn things around in my career.
Wow. Well, that is a message that I certainly like to hear. My dad's a Burger King franchisee in the New York metro area, and I've been having conversations with him, and I think he makes such a key point that maybe many folks don't realize that franchisees are small business owners. In terms of the conversations you are having with some of those franchisees you represent, what is playing out in real time on the ground? Are stores able, at least the drive-thrus, able to stay open? Are something like layoffs now on the table, as we've heard from some other industries, for example, in hospitality?
I said this to the president, and I've said it to the secretary and also to the members of Congress. Small business people are making decisions every day on a day-by-day basis. When, the parking garage in my building here down in Washington, D.C. is half empty, I can tell you that the Corner Bakery, one of our members around the corner that's just around the corner here, knows that day that their lunch business is down by 50%. So they adjust and work very quickly. And so getting assurance from the government and having an understanding that people are putting politics aside and that it is America first in this regard, and they're working to move things forward very quickly, give them some amount of comfort. But I can tell you, of course, from your own family's experience, that there is high distress because these people that have